Winter is a season of contrasts, beautiful and deadly, silent yet full of secrets. The snow blankets the earth, hiding everything it touches. But what if the stillness isn't peace? What if the silence conceals something darker? Here on Mystara Shadows, we explore what the frost refuses to bury. Tales of shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers that cut through the cold, and mysteries that linger long after the snow melts. Stay close. Tonight, we'll walk through the icy unknown. But remember, in the heart of winter, even the snow listens. The road was endless, a ribbon of white stretching into the void of the Alaskan wilderness. Snow had begun to fall hours ago, heavy and relentless, erasing the edges of the world until I was driving through a tunnel carved into the storm. The GPS had long since given up, replaced by the static void of no signal, and my only companions were the low hum of the heater and the faint crunch of snow under my tires. The map on the passenger seat felt useless, a relic from a time when paper meant certainty. Now, it was just a frayed corner of hope in a place that seemed to be swallowing me whole. There were no mile markers, no signs, nothing to tell me how close or how far I was from silent reach. The name itself had clung to my thoughts for days, ever since I'd found the obscure reference buried in an old forum thread. A place so remote, so isolated, that its name barely existed on maps. The thread spoke of endless winters and an uncanny silence that settled over the town like a shroud. It wasn't described as haunted exactly, but there were enough whispers, enough half-formed warnings to make me wonder what had really happened there. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't just the storm, though the snow had turned from a gentle fall to a suffocating weight that blanketed the windshield, no matter how fast the wipers worked. There was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The way the trees seemed to lean closer to the road, their gnarled branches reaching like frozen fingers. The way the headlights caught glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line, shadows darting between the trunks, quick enough to be mistaken for tricks of the light, but too deliberate to dismiss entirely. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but the unease had already settled deep in my chest, a weight that grew heavier with every passing mile. When the town finally appeared, it was so sudden, so abrupt, that I nearly missed it entirely. One moment, I was driving through an endless expanse of snow and trees. The next, the road widened into what could generously be called a town square. Silent Reach was smaller than I had imagined, barely more than a handful of buildings scattered along a single road. Most of them were dark, their windows frosted over, their rooftops sagging under the weight of snow. The only light came from a single lamppost in the center of the square, its bulb flickering faintly as though struggling against the cold. The storm seemed to ease as I pulled into the square, the snow falling in softer, almost hesitant flakes, but the silence was absolute. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of my engine and the distant whisper of wind threading through the trees. I parked in front of what I assumed was the general store, though the sign above the door was so faded it was impossible to tell. The glass of the windows was covered in a thick layer of frost, but I could make out the faint shapes of shelves inside, their contents coated in the same thin sheen of ice that seemed to cover everything in this town. As I stepped out of the car, the cold hit me like a physical force, sharp and immediate, clawing at my skin even through my layers of clothing. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outside, as though the walls themselves were leaching the warmth from the room. The shelves were lined with cans and boxes, all covered in frost, their labels faded and unreadable. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its flame flickering faintly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. There was no sign of anyone, no clerk, no customers. Just the silence, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. I wandered the aisles, my boots crunching against the frost-covered floor, my breath fogging the air in front of me. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, curling and stretching along the walls, their edges too sharp, too deliberate to be natural. A faint flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow darting past the frosted window at the far end of the store. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, my chest tightening as I stared at the window. The frost on the glass seemed to thicken, curling into patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost recognizable. But when I blinked, the shapes dissolved into nothing. The wind outside picked up, howling faintly as it threaded through the cracks in the walls. It carried with it a sound, faint and indistinct, like a whisper just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any, but the tone was clear, soft, insistent, and filled with a sense of urgency that made my skin crawl. I turned toward the door, my breath fogging the air as I tried to shake the feeling that something was watching me, something I couldn't see but could feel, pressing against the edges of my thoughts. The cabin was at the edge of town, just as the forum thread had described. It was small and unassuming, its walls weathered and its roof sloping under the weight of snow. A single lantern hung on the porch, its flame flickering faintly, casting long shadows across the frost-covered steps. Inside, the air was slightly warmer, though the cold still clung to the walls like a living thing. The fireplace was empty, but a stack of wood sat nearby, and I wasted no time in lighting a fire. As the flames crackled to life, the warmth began to seep into my skin, chasing away the sharp bite of the cold. But the unease didn't fade. It clung to me like a second layer, heavier than the frost that had settled on my coat. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every crackle, every breath. It wasn't until I noticed the carvings that the unease turned to dread. They were faint but unmistakable, etched into the wooden beams that framed the windows and doors. Sharp, angular lines that twisted and curled in ways that made my eyes ache. They looked old, ancient even, but there was a precision to them that felt deliberate, intentional. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, the wood cold and rough beneath my touch, and felt the faintest vibration, as though the carving itself was alive. That night, the light returned. It flickered faintly through the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was the lantern on the porch, but this light was different. It pulsed in time with something I couldn't hear, threading through the frost-covered air like a distant heartbeat. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard the wind begin to whisper. The flickering light outside the cabin hadn't disappeared. It pulsed faintly in the distance, threading through the darkness like a lure, calling me toward the edge of the woods. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the lantern's reflection, or maybe some strange quirk of the frost-covered air. But the longer I stared at it, the harder it became to dismiss. There was a rhythm to its flicker, an almost deliberate pattern, like the slow, steady beat of a pulse. My pulse. The wind outside howled faintly, its whisper threading through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but there was something in its tone, a resonance that made my skin crawl. I sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my chest. Every crackle of the flames felt too loud, too sharp against the heavy stillness that pressed against the cabin. When I couldn't take it anymore, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp and immediate, clawing at my skin through the layers of fabric. The light was still there, flickering faintly just beyond the tree line, its pale glow casting jagged shadows across the snow. My boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as I stepped closer, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The air felt heavier here, sharper, carrying a metallic tang that lingered in the back of my throat. The closer I got to the light, the harder it became to focus. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their gnarled branches reaching toward me like frozen claws. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision, darting between the trunks, quick and deliberate. Every step felt heavier than the last, the snow dragging at my feet as though it were alive, trying to pull me down, to stop me from moving forward. And then I saw it. The mine entrance loomed ahead, its jagged outline barely visible against the shadows of the forest. The light pulsed faintly from within, threading through the heavy air like a heartbeat, drawing me closer. Frost clung to the edges of the opening, its sharp, angular patterns curling into shapes that looked almost familiar, almost deliberate. The air around it was colder than anywhere else, sharp and biting, burning my skin with every breath. The carvings were everywhere. They covered the wooden beams that framed the entrance, their sharp lines curling and twisting into intricate patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, their shapes too precise, too deliberate to be natural. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, the wood cold and rough beneath my touch, and felt the faintest vibration, as though the symbols themselves were alive, pulsing faintly in time with the light. The wind picked up again, threading through the trees with a low guttural hum that pressed against my chest like a heavy hand. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't the howl of the storm or the rustle of branches in the wind. It was something else, something deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the air, the frost, the carvings, and my very bones. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to go back to the cabin, to lock the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the light was calling me, pulling me forward with an urgency I couldn't ignore. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, the beam cutting through the darkness in jagged, uneven bursts. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The mine was empty, or so it seemed. The light flickered faintly just ahead, casting long shadows against the frost-covered walls. The carvings continued inside, their sharp lines glowing faintly in the dim light, curling into shapes that twisted and shifted at the edges of my vision. The air was colder here, sharper, carrying a metallic tang that made it hard to breathe. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the walls in ways that felt wrong, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. The whispers started then, faint at first, just a soft thread of sound weaving through the heavy silence. But as I moved deeper into the mine, they grew louder, sharper, threading through the air like a blade. They weren't words, not exactly, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that made my skin crawl. It felt as though the walls themselves were speaking, their frost-covered surfaces vibrating faintly with every whisper, every hum. The flashlight died without warning. The darkness that followed was absolute, suffocating, pressing against my chest like a heavy weight. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to find the flashlight app, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. The whispers grew louder, threading through the darkness, curling around me like a living thing. I could feel the frost creeping closer, its sharp edges biting into my skin, threading through the air, the shadows, my thoughts. And then the light returned. It pulsed faintly just ahead, casting jagged shadows against the frost-covered walls. But it wasn't coming from my flashlight or my phone. It was coming from the carvings themselves, their sharp lines glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing in time with the whispers, the hum, the frost. The patterns shifted and twisted, curling into shapes that felt almost recognizable, almost deliberate, as though they were trying to tell me something, to show me something. I turned and ran. The air seemed to grow heavier as I moved, pressing against my chest, my legs, my thoughts. The whispers followed me, threading through the darkness, growing louder, sharper, more insistent. The light pulsed faintly behind me, its rhythm matching the beat of my heart, threading through the frost, the shadows, the air. When I finally stumbled out of the mine, the wind hit me like a wall, sharp and immediate, clawing at my skin with an urgency that felt almost alive. The light was gone, the whispers silenced, but the frost still clung to my skin, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The carvings on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, their sharp lines curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving ghostly traces behind when I blinked. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the fire had gone out, the air inside colder than it had been before. The frost on the windows had spread, its sharp, angular patterns curling into intricate shapes that mirrored the carvings in the mine. And there, scrawled in the frost-covered glass, was a single message: "Do not follow the wind." The frost-covered words on the window haunted me long after I'd read them. "Do not follow the wind." The message pulsed in my thoughts like a heartbeat, threading through the silence of the cabin and burrowing deep into my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that the words were more than a warning. They were a command, one that carried an unspoken weight I couldn't ignore. But the wind outside had already started its whispering again, faint and insistent, curling through the cracks in the walls, drawing me back to the mine. The fire was struggling to stay alive, its flames barely licking at the frost-covered logs. The cold in the room was sharper now, biting into my skin even though I sat inches from the hearth. The frost on the windows was spreading, its angular patterns curling and twisting into shapes that seemed deliberate, almost purposeful. Every time I looked at them, the shapes shifted, dissolving into chaos the moment my eyes tried to focus. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers grew louder as the hours passed, threading through the heavy silence of the cabin like needles piercing the air. They weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside the walls, vibrating faintly through the wood, curling around the edges of my thoughts. I wrapped myself in a blanket, my breath fogging the air as I stared at the frost-covered windows, waiting for the dawn to come. When the first pale light of morning crept through the frost, I stepped outside. The snow was untouched, pristine, as though the storm had never happened. The trees stood silent and still, their gnarled branches heavy with ice, casting jagged shadows across the ground. The air was heavier now, sharper, carrying a metallic tang that lingered in the back of my throat. The carvings on the trees glinted faintly in the morning light, their sharp lines curling into shapes that looked almost alive. I followed the path back into town, my boots crunching against the snow in a rhythm that felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. Silent Reach was exactly as I'd left it, desolate, abandoned, its buildings sagging under the weight of snow and frost. The lamppost in the square flickered faintly, its light struggling against the oppressive cold. The shadows of the buildings stretched long and jagged across the snow, their edges too sharp, too deliberate. The general store was still empty, its shelves lined with frost-covered cans and boxes, their labels faded and unreadable. I wandered the aisles, my breath fogging the icy air, searching for something. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Answers, perhaps, or maybe just a reason to stay. But the longer I stayed in that building, the heavier the air seemed to grow, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very being. I found the journal in a drawer behind the counter. Its cover was cracked and brittle, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The handwriting inside was jagged and uneven, as though the author had written in a hurry, their hand trembling with every stroke. The first few entries were mundane, notes about inventory, weather conditions, idle gossip about the town. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, sharper, their words laced with desperation. They spoke of the mine, of strange lights flickering in the woods at night, of whispers that seemed to come from the frost itself. The author wrote of shadows that moved at the edges of their vision, of figures that appeared in the snow during storms, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. The final entries were barely legible, their lines scrawled in a frenzy of panic. The mine is alive. Do not listen to the wind. The frost is watching. The last page was blank, the ink smudged, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. I closed the journal, my hands trembling, the frost biting into my fingers through the brittle paper. The weight in my chest grew heavier as I stepped out of the store, the air colder now, sharper, threading through my veins like a living thing. The mine was calling me again. The wind had picked up, its whispers threading through the trees, curling around the edges of the square like a taunt. The frost on the buildings pulsed faintly, their sharp lines twisting into patterns that burned into my vision. I tried to ignore it, to turn back toward the cabin, but the pull was stronger now, threading through my thoughts like a command I couldn't disobey. By the time I reached the mine, the light was already flickering again, pulsing faintly from within the shadows of the entrance. The carvings on the wooden beams glowed faintly in the dim light, their sharp lines twisting and curling in ways that made my head ache. The air here was heavier, sharper, vibrating faintly with an energy I couldn't place. I stepped inside. Darkness swallowed me immediately, heavier and more oppressive than before. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their sharp lines pulsing in time with the light that flickered deeper within the mine. The frost on the ground crunched beneath my boots, its sharp edges biting into the soles with every step. The whispers were louder here, threading through the air like a melody just out of reach. The journal had spoken of a gateway, of a place deep within the mine where the frost and shadows converged. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but the light was leading me deeper, threading through the darkness like a beacon. The walls seemed to close in as I moved, their frost-covered surfaces pulsing faintly, their carvings twisting into shapes that made my stomach churn. I found the gateway at the heart of the mine. It wasn't a door, not exactly. It was a formation of ice, jagged and sharp, its surface glowing faintly with a cold blue light. The carvings on its surface pulsed in time with the whispers, threading through the frost, the shadows, the air. The frost on the ground crept closer to the formation, curling around its edges like fingers, drawing me toward it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the air, the frost, the light, it was all too much, crushing me under its presence. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision. The whispers grew louder, sharper, threading through the air like a blade. And then the frost began to spread. The frost moved like a living thing, curling across the jagged ice formation and spreading outward. It crawled over the ground in tendrils, its sharp edges biting into the stone as it moved toward me. The air around the gateway had changed, no longer just cold, but suffocating, heavy with an energy that felt almost sentient. Every breath I took burned, the metallic tang of the frost filling my lungs and clawing at my throat. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently now, their angular shapes twisting and curling in impossible ways. They glowed brighter with each passing moment, casting jagged shadows across the cavern that seemed to move independently of the light. My thoughts felt fractured, pulled in a dozen different directions at once, as though the carvings were threading themselves into my mind, rearranging my very sense of self. I tried to turn back, to run, but the frost had already crept around my boots, holding me in place. My legs felt heavy, numb, as though the frost had rooted itself into my skin. The whispers grew louder, threading through the air like a melody out of tune. They weren't just in the room anymore. They were in me, curling through my thoughts, threading through the cracks in my mind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, insistent, commanding, impossible to ignore. The light from the ice formation pulsed brighter, matching the rhythm of the whispers. The carvings on its surface twisted and shifted, forming shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The frost on the ground began to rise, curling upward like smoke, threading through the air in jagged spirals. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was alive, vibrating with an energy that pressed against my chest, my lungs, my thoughts. The journal's words came back to me, faint and fragmented. Do not follow the wind. The frost is watching. The gateway must stay sealed. But the gateway wasn't sealed anymore. It was opening, the ice formation cracking and splintering as the frost poured out in waves. The whispers grew sharper, cutting through the air like a blade, their rhythm matching the pulsing light and the jagged vibrations that shook the cavern. And then The figures appeared. They emerged from the frost, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. Their outlines shimmered faintly, like reflections on broken glass, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes were empty, their faces frozen in expressions that twisted and shifted with every flicker of the light. They didn't speak, but their presence carried the same weight as the whispers, pressing against my chest like a heavy hand. They moved closer, their steps soundless against the frost-covered ground. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, the frost holding me in place as they surrounded me. Their faces were wrong, shifting, blurring, as though they couldn't decide what shape to take. And their eyes, though empty, seemed to see everything, piercing through me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. One of them reached out, its hand shimmering like ice, its fingers curling toward my face. The frost on my skin burned where it touched me, sharp and cold, threading through my veins like fire. I tried to pull away, but the frost held me tighter, biting into my legs, my arms, my throat. The whispers grew deafening, their rhythm threading through my thoughts, overwhelming everything else. The figure's hand pressed against my chest, and the carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their shapes twisting into patterns that mirrored the frost crawling across my skin. The ice formation at the center of the cavern cracked again, the sound echoing through the heavy air like the tolling of a bell. The light within it pulsed violently, threading through the frost, the carvings, the shadows, and the figures. And then, everything went still. The light dimmed, the frost stopped moving, and the whispers faded into silence. Figures froze in place, their jagged outlines shimmering faintly in the dim light. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their sharp lines no longer twisting, but holding steady in patterns that burned into my vision. The figure in front of me stepped back, its movements slow and deliberate. It tilted its head, its empty eyes locked on mine, and for a moment the silence was worse than the whispers. It raised one hand, its fingers curling into a shape I couldn't understand, and pointed toward the ice formation. The light within it pulsed faintly, its rhythm slow and deliberate, matching the heavy beat of my heart. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn away, to close my eyes, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the pull was stronger now, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. My legs moved on their own, the frost releasing its grip as I stumbled toward the formation. The carvings on surface glowed faintly, their sharp lines curling into shapes that felt both ancient and alive. The light within the formation pulsed one final time before the ice shattered. The force of the blast knocked me to the ground, the air filled with shards of ice and waves of frost. The figures dissolved into mist, their jagged outlines fading as the cavern trembled violently. The carvings on the walls twisted one final time before fading into darkness, leaving behind only faint traces of their presence. The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the heavy silence like an echo. The ice formation was gone, replaced by a jagged hole that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. The frost on the ground curled toward it, drawn by an invisible force, threading through the air like smoke. The carvings on my skin burned faintly, their sharp lines glowing in time with the light, threading through my veins like fire. I crawled toward the edge of the hole, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The light within it pulsed faintly, slow and deliberate, casting jagged shadows across the cavern. And somewhere deep within, faint but unmistakable, I heard the whispers again. They were louder this time, sharper, threading through the frost, the carvings, the shadows, and my thoughts. The figures were gone, the frost was retreating, but the weight in my chest remained, heavier than ever. The journal's words echoed in my mind, faint and fragmented. The gateway must stay sealed, but it wasn't sealed anymore. The hole pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored the pounding in my chest, slow and deliberate, each pulse sending out waves of icy air that clawed at my skin. The light emanating from within wasn't natural. It was sharp and jagged, shifting hues between pale blue and silver. its glow casting impossible shapes across the cavern walls. The carvings, though faded, seemed to twitch in response, their lines faintly alive, as though they had been waiting for this very moment to stir again. I knelt at the edge of the hole, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned in the frigid air. The frost on my skin had spread, curling up my arms and legs, weaving patterns beneath the surface, as though it had become part of me. The frost numbed me, yet my mind was aflame, each thought sharp and vivid, threading through the silence like a scream. And then I heard the whispers. They didn't come from the air around me this time. They came from within, from the frost, from the carvings, from the pulsing light deep within the hole. They wove through my thoughts with a precision that felt surgical, stripping away everything else until I was left with only the sound of their voices threading through my mind. The words weren't human, not in any language I could recognize, but I understood them all the same. The veil is thin. You open the wound. The frost around the hole began to move, curling inward, drawn toward the pulsing light. It moved like liquid, threading through the cracks in the ground, sinking into the hole, as though it belonged to whatever lay beneath. The air grew colder with each passing moment, sharper, biting into my exposed skin with a ferocity that felt almost alive. The carvings on the cavern walls glowed faintly, their shapes twisting and shifting in time with the light. And then I saw it. A figure began to rise from the hole. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow against the pulsing light, indistinct and formless. But as it rose, it began to take shape, its edges sharp and angular, its form too tall, too narrow, too wrong to be human. It shimmered like the frost, its surface reflecting the jagged light in broken fragments that burned into my vision. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, an emptiness that seemed to swallow the light, casting shadows where none should have been. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, the frost holding me in place as the figure loomed above me. Its presence was suffocating, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift, threading through my thoughts like a needle pulling thread. The whispers grew louder, sharper, vibrating through the air, the frost, the carvings, and my very soul. You woke it, you brought it through. The words were mine, but not mine, threading through my mind in a voice I didn't recognize. The figure didn't move, but the space around it seemed to shift, curling and twisting in ways that defied logic. The light from the hole pulsed brighter, casting jagged shadows across the cavern that moved independently of the light. The frost beneath my feet began to crack, splintering into jagged shards that spread outward like veins. The figure extended a hand, or something resembling a hand, toward me. Its fingers were long and thin, sharp at the tips, shimmering with the same broken light that pulsed from the hole. The air grew heavier as it reached for me, pressing against my chest, my lungs, my very being. The frost on my skin burned where its shadow touched me, threading deeper into my veins, curling around my thoughts like chains. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My voice was swallowed by the whispers, the light, the frost. The figure's hand stopped inches from my face, its jagged edges shimmering faintly in the dim light. And then it spoke. The veil cannot hold. The ground beneath me gave way, the frost shattering into 1,000 jagged shards that spiraled into the hole. The light erupted in a blinding flash, filling the cavern with a cold so intense it felt like fire, burning through my skin, my veins, my very soul. The figure dissolved into the light, its form breaking apart into jagged fragments that threaded through the frost, the carvings, the air. And then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the cavern was gone. I was lying in the snow, the sky above me pale and empty, the air heavy with the silence of a world holding its breath. The frost was still on my skin, curling beneath the surface, threading through my veins like a living thing. The carvings were gone, the figures were gone, but the weight in my chest remained, heavier than ever. Silent Reach was no longer a town. The buildings had crumbled, their outlines barely visible beneath the snow. The lamppost in the square was shattered, its light extinguished. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood taller now, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like frozen hands. The frost on their bark glinted faintly in the dim light, their sharp lines curling into shapes I couldn't understand. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, threading through the frost that still clung to me, weaving itself into the fabric of my being. I stumbled through the snow, my legs heavy, my breath burning in the frigid air. The weight in my chest grew heavier with each step, the frost curling tighter around my thoughts, my veins, my soul. And then I heard it, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a memory I couldn't escape, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. It carried with it a single haunting phrase, threading through the frost, the silence, and my very soul. The veil is open. The snow began just before I reached the mountains, a soft dusting at first, but by the time I turned onto the narrow road leading to Winter's Hollow, the world was consumed by white. It clung to the windshield, muted the world outside, and made the forest on either side of the road feel endless. My breath fogged the inside of the car, and even with the heater on full blast, the cold seemed to seep in, curling its way into my bones. The letter sat on the passenger seat, its edges curling with damp, the ink smudged from my hands, gripping it too tightly. The answers you seek are in Winter's Hollow. The words were maddening in their simplicity, just cryptic enough to draw me in but vague enough to offer no real explanation. Answers to what? Why had it been left at my door? Why had I felt the pull to follow it, as though some invisible thread had wrapped around my chest and was reeling me in, dragging me toward this godforsaken place in the middle of nowhere? The questions swirled in my mind like the snow outside, an endless storm that left me dizzy and disoriented. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, replaced by a taunting, no-service message that felt more ominous than it should have. The road was barely visible now, a strip of white winding through an endless sea of frost-covered trees. Each mile felt like it stretched longer than the last, the snow falling heavier, faster, until it felt as though the car was being swallowed whole. And yet, I couldn't stop. Something in the pit of my stomach, deeper than logic, told me that I had to keep going. The first sign of Winter's Hollow was a wooden post at the side of the road, barely visible beneath layers of snow and ice. The words carved into the wood were nearly illegible, but I could just make out the name, Winter's Hollow. Beneath it, another message had been scrawled in red paint, faded but still distinct. Turn back. The paint had bled into the wood, dripping downward in jagged streaks that looked almost like claw marks. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The town appeared as though it had been dropped there by accident, a cluster of buildings huddled together in the snow, surrounded by endless forest. The storm had eased slightly, but the wind still howled, threading through the empty streets and carrying with it a strange, low hum that vibrated in my chest. The snow muffled everything else, swallowing the sound of my tires crunching over ice and the low rumble of the engine. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The buildings were old, their wooden walls weathered and sagging under the weight of snow. Frost covered the windows, curling in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, like symbols etched into the glass. There were no lights, no signs of life, just empty streets and an oppressive sense of stillness that made my skin crawl. I parked in front of what looked like an inn, its sign swinging faintly in the wind. The words Hollow Hearth Inn were carved into the wood, though the letters were nearly obscured by frost. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the stillness like a scream. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, a biting chill that clung to my skin and made my breath fog in front of me. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, its weak flame casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Furniture was scattered throughout the space, wooden chairs, a long table, a counter with a rusted bell, but everything was covered in a thin layer of frost. It was as though the cold had seeped into the very foundation of the building, claiming it as its own. I wandered through the room, my boots crunching against the frost-covered floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a physical weight. My eyes were drawn to the carvings on the walls, sharp, angular lines etched into the wood, their patterns twisting and curling in ways that made my head ache. They didn't look like graffiti or decoration. They looked ancient, purposeful, and wrong. Upstairs, I found a room with a single bed pushed against the far wall. The mattress was bare, the blankets thin and threadbare, offering little comfort against the cold. The window overlooked the main street, but there was nothing to see, just snow and shadows. I dropped my bag onto the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, my breath fogging the air as I stared out at the empty town. And then I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, faint and fleeting, like a candle struggling against the wind. It came from the edge of the forest, just beyond the last row of buildings, pulsing faintly before disappearing into the storm. My chest tightened, my heart pounding against my ribs as I leaned closer to the window, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The light flickered again, and this time it was followed by movement. A shadow darting between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be human. The wind outside picked up, its low hum growing louder, more insistent. It carried with it a sound I couldn't place, faint and indistinct, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. I stared at the frost-covered glass, the patterns etched into it shifting subtly, as though they were live, twisting into shapes that felt familiar but unrecognizable. And then, through the fogged window, I saw them. Footprints. They appeared in the snow just beyond the inn, leading from the forest to the middle of the street. They were deep and deliberate, each step perfectly placed, but there was no one there to make them. They stopped abruptly, as though the person or thing had simply vanished into the storm. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening as I stared at the empty street. The footprints burned into my vision. The light flickered again, brighter this time, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, their edges jagged and unnatural. The carvings on the walls of the inn pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a cold blue light that made my skin crawl. The wind outside howled, its tone shifting into something almost human, almost like a voice calling me into the snow. And then, for the first time, I heard the whisper. They were faint at first, just a thread of sound weaving through the stillness, but as I listened, they grew louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts like needles. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried meaning all the same. They weren't asking. They were commanding. Come in. The whispers followed me into the morning, threading through my thoughts like strands of frost weaving into the walls. They had quieted as the hours passed, but never fully left, lingering in the edges of my mind. The cold remained too, sharper now, clinging to my skin in ways that didn't feel natural. It wasn't just the air, it was the town itself, its silence pressing against me like an unwelcome weight. Winter's Hollow wasn't just abandoned. It was hollow in ways I couldn't explain, as though the very essence of the place had been drained, leaving behind an echo of something broken. I left the inn, not because I wanted to, but because staying inside felt worse. The carvings on the walls had begun to shift during the night, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that left a dull ache behind my eyes whenever I stared too long. And the whispers, soft as they were, seemed louder in the confined space, threading through the frost-covered furniture and curling into the air like smoke. The main street was buried under snow, the buildings leaning inward as though they were closing in on one another. The frost had taken over here, covering windows, and doorways, creeping up walls in jagged, unnatural patterns. I kept my footsteps light, the crunch of snow beneath my boots feeling like an intrusion in the suffocating stillness. The air carried a sharp, metallic tang that left an unpleasant taste in my mouth, and every exhale fogged the space in front of me, hanging longer than it should have, like the cold was reluctant to let me breathe. It didn't take long to realize that Winter's Hollow was frozen in more ways than one. Doors were left ajar, their handles encased in thick layers of frost. I peeked into what looked like an old diner, the faded sign above the entrance barely legible. Inside, the booths were still intact, though the red vinyl seats had long since cracked and peeled. On one of the tables, 2 coffee cups sat side by side, their surfaces iced over, the faint outlines of fingerprints still visible on the glass. Whoever had been here last had left in a hurry, but not recently. The layers of frost told a different story, one where time itself had been frozen in this place. The silence pressed harder here, heavier, as though the walls of the diner were holding something back. I turned to leave, but paused when I caught my reflection in the frosted window. The shapes on the glass had shifted again, jagged lines curling into symbols I didn't recognize. But behind me, in the reflection, there was something else. A shadow, faint and indistinct, standing by the counter. I spun around, my breath catching in my chest, but the space was empty. The air felt colder now, sharper, the frost creeping further up the walls. I stepped back out onto the street, the cold biting into my exposed skin. The storm had stopped, leaving behind a pale, muted sky that cast long shadows across the town. They stretched unnaturally, their edges too sharp, twisting in ways that didn't match the angle of the light. I tried to shake the unease, but it clung to me, burrowing into the space between my ribs, like the frost that seemed to linger on everything I touched. It was then that I noticed the library. It stood apart from the other buildings, taller, its windows covered in thick layers of ice that reflected the pale sky in fragmented patterns. The steps leading up to the entrance were buried under snow, but something about the building pulled at me, like a thread winding tighter with every step I took. The door was heavy, the frost clinging to it making it difficult to push open, but eventually it gave way with a groan that echoed into the silence. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outside. The shelves were lined with books, their spines cracked and warped from the frost, their titles barely visible. The floor was covered in a thin layer of ice that cracked beneath my boots, the sound sharp and unnatural in the stillness. At first glance, it seemed empty, just another relic of a town abandoned by time. But as I moved deeper into the aisles, I realized I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, faint but distinct, threading through the silence like the low hum of wind. They came from the far corner of the library, where the light didn't quite reach. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but the pull was stronger now, threading through my chest, dragging me forward. The frost on the shelves seemed to thicken as I approached, curling into jagged patterns that felt almost familiar. The books in this section were different. Their covers were wrapped in dark leather, their pages edged in frost. I ran my fingers over one of them, the surface colder than ice, and opened it to find pages filled with carvings, sharp, angular lines that twisted and curled into symbols I couldn't begin to understand. They burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. At the end of the aisle, I found the source of the whispers. A table sat beneath a frost-covered window, its surface cluttered with journals and loose pages. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as though the words had been written in desperation. One journal in particular caught my eye, its cover cracked and brittle. The name Elliot hadn't scrawled across the front. I opened it, my breath fogging the air as I read the first few entries. The words were fragmented, filled with references to the gathering and the hollowing cold. The writer spoke of rituals, of sacrifices made to protect the town from something that lurked beyond the frost. But the entries grew more erratic as they continued, the handwriting jagged, the words frenzied. "We failed. The seal is broken. The frost is spreading. The journal slipped from my hands as a sudden chill swept through the library, sharp and biting, threading through the aisles like a living thing. The frost on the shelves pulsed faintly, its patterns shifting, twisting into shapes that made my head ache. And then, from somewhere deep within the library, I heard it again. The whispers. But this time, they weren't distant. They were right behind me. The whispers were no longer just faint threads of sound weaving through the frost. They were close now, impossibly close, curling through the air like icy tendrils. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, every nerve in my body screaming for me to move, to run, to escape. But I couldn't. The frost beneath my feet felt alive, its jagged edges pressing against my boots, anchoring me in place. Behind me, the air felt heavier, colder, as though the very space around me was folding in on itself. I forced myself to turn, my movements slow and deliberate, every muscle in my body trembling with a fear I couldn't control. The library was still empty, or at least it seemed to be. The shelves stretched into the darkness, their frost-covered edges glinting faintly in the dim light. But the air was alive now, vibrating with an energy that pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, sharper, threading through the silence with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. They weren't words, not exactly, but there was meaning in them all the same. An unspoken command that made my skin crawl. The frost on the shelves pulsed faintly in time with the whispers, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision. I stumbled back toward the table, my hands trembling as I grabbed the journal I'd dropped. The pages felt colder now, the frost clinging to the edges biting into my fingers. I flipped through them frantically, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the words on the pages had changed. The sharp, jagged handwriting was no longer just a record of the past. It was speaking to me directly. The hollowing is here. You must find the seal. You must stop the cold. The journal slipped from my hands as the frost on the table began to spread, curling upward in jagged spirals that threaded through the air like smoke. The whispers grew louder, vibrating through the room, the air, my very bones. I stumbled back, my breath fogging the air as I turned toward the exit, but the frost had already reached the door. It climbed the walls, its sharp edges curling into patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. The library wasn't just cold anymore. It was alive. The whispers reached a crescendo, a sharp, piercing sound that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. The frost beneath my feet cracked, its jagged edges splitting into sharp shards that spiraled outward, forming a circle around the table. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest with a force that made it impossible to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, threading through the frost that still clung to me. The glow from the carvings on the walls faded, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. The frost on the shelves stopped moving, its jagged lines frozen in place. But the weight in the air remained, heavier than ever, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. I stumbled out of the library, the cold biting into my skin with every step. The pale light of the sky offered little comfort, its muted glow casting long, jagged shadows across the snow-covered ground. The town felt even more desolate now. The silence heavier, the frost thicker. The footprints I'd seen earlier were gone, swallowed by the storm, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had grown stronger. I found myself drawn toward the center of the town, where the outline of the church loomed against the pale sky. Its steeple was crooked, leaning precariously under the weight of years and snow, but the building itself seemed untouched by the decay that had consumed the rest of the town. The frost on its walls glinted faintly, the sharp lines curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings I'd seen in the library. The doors were heavy, their surface covered in frost that cracked and splintered as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was colder than I'd ever felt, sharp and biting, threading through my veins like a living thing. The pews were empty, their wooden surfaces warped and splintered, the frost curling over their edges like claws. At the front of the church, where an altar should have been, there was only ice. It rose from the ground in jagged, unnatural spikes, their sharp edges glinting faintly in the dim light. The carvings on their surface pulsed faintly, their lines twisting and curling in ways that made my head ache. The frost around the base of the formation crept outward, threading through the cracks in the floor, curling around the edges of the pews. The air around it was heavier, sharper, vibrating with an energy that pressed against my chest like a heavy hand. I stepped closer, my movements slow and deliberate, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. But the pull was stronger now, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The frost on the walls pulsed faintly, their sharp lines twisting into patterns that mirrored the carvings on the ice. The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the air like a melody just out of reach. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface of the ice. It was colder than anything I'd ever felt, sharp and biting, threading through my skin like fire. The carvings on its surface glowed brighter, their sharp lines curling into shapes that felt both ancient and alive. And then the whispers grew louder. The air around me seemed to fold in on itself, the frost curling upward in jagged spirals that threaded through the light, the shadows, the carvings. The glow from the ice pulsed brighter, its rhythm matching the heavy beat of my heart. The frost beneath my feet cracked, splintering into sharp shards that spiraled outward, forming a circle around the altar. And then the ice began to move. The ice surged forward like a living thing, twisting and cracking, with a sound that vibrated through the air and settled deep in my chest. It wasn't just ice anymore. It pulsed, sharp and jagged, with an energy that felt ancient, otherworldly. My hand recoiled, the tips of my fingers burning as though they had been seared by fire, not frost. The carvings on the ice glowed brighter now, their sharp, angular patterns shifting and curling into shapes that defied logic. I stepped back, but the air was heavier, denser, wrapping around me and rooting me in place. The frost on the ground beneath my boots began to shift, threading outward in jagged spirals that mirrored the carvings. The whispers returned, louder this time, cutting through the heavy silence like knives. They weren't faint echoes anymore. They were in the room, vibrating through the air, threading through the frost, wrapping around my thoughts. The glow from the ice grew brighter, casting long, jagged shadows across the church walls. The pews, already warped and splintered, seemed to shudder under the weight of whatever was happening, their wooden surfaces creaking and groaning as frost crept over them. The carvings on the walls pulsed in time with the glow, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. I tried to move, to run, but the frost beneath my feet climbed higher, curling around my legs like icy chains. The whispers grew sharper, threading through the air like a melody out of tune, their rhythm jagged and unnatural. And then, from deep within the ice, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, faint and indistinct, shifting and curling within the frozen depths. But as the glow intensified, the shadow took shape, its edges sharp and angular, too deliberate to be natural. It moved slowly, its form flickering like the light of a dying flame, its jagged outline shimmering faintly in the pulsing glow. My chest tightened as I watched it rise, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its angles too sharp. Its surface shimmered like frost, reflecting the pale light in fragmented patterns that seemed to shift and twist as I stared. Where its face should have been, there was only emptiness, a void that seemed to swallow the light, casting jagged shadows that stretched across the frost-covered floor. The whispers swelled, louder now, vibrating through the air with a force that made my knees buckle. The frost beneath my feet cracked, splintering into sharp shards that spiraled outward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. The figure tilted its head, its empty face turning toward me. And though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost on the walls began to move, curling upward in jagged spirals that threaded through the air like smoke. The carvings pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that seemed alive, almost breathing. The glow from the ice surged, casting the room in a pale, sharp light that burned against my skin. The figure raised one long, jagged hand, its movements slow and deliberate, its fingers curling into a shape I couldn't understand. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a feeling, threading through my thoughts like needles, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until it was all I could hear. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them all the same. They carried a weight that pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. The seal is broken, the hollowing begins. The frost surged upward, curling around my legs, my chest, threading through my veins like fire. I gasped, my breath fogging the air as the frost crept higher, burning and biting, threading through my skin as though it had become part of me. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their shapes unraveling into jagged lines that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the frost-covered floor like a distant thunderclap. The air grew heavier with each movement, pressing against me, wrapping around me like a vice. The frost on the ground pulsed in time with its steps, curling and shifting, threading through the jagged lines that now covered the walls. I stumbled back, the frost breaking beneath my boots, my chest tight, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The figure loomed closer, its jagged form shimmering faintly, its sharp edges casting shadows that stretched and curled across the frost-covered floor. The carvings on its surface glowed faintly, their sharp lines twisting into patterns that felt both ancient and alive. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their rhythm sharp and jagged, threading through the frost, the carvings, the light, and my thoughts. The glow from the ice surged one final time, brighter than before, its light sharp and jagged, cutting through the air like a blade. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The frost froze in place, its jagged edges sharp and unmoving. The light dimmed, its sharp glow fading into a faint, pale flicker. The figure stood still, its jagged form casting long shadows across the frost-covered floor, its empty face turned toward me. The air was heavy with silence, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The frost beneath my feet creaked faintly, its jagged edges shifting, threading through the cracks in the floor. The figure raised one long, jagged hand, its movement slow and deliberate, its fingers curling into a shape I couldn't understand. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, pale light that burned into my vision. And then, from deep within the ice, I heard it again. The whispers. The whispers twisted through the heavy silence, rising and falling like a tide I couldn't escape. They pulled at my thoughts, fraying the edges of my mind until it felt like I was unraveling piece by piece. The frost beneath my feet cracked again, sharp and deliberate, the sound cutting through the oppressive stillness. The figure hadn't moved, but its presence loomed larger now, filling the room in ways that defied reason. The void where its face should have been felt alive, shifting and pulsing as though it were drawing in the light, the frost, and the air itself. The carvings on the walls flared to life again, their sharp, jagged lines twisting into shapes that made my chest ache with a pressure I couldn't name. The frost curled upward in delicate spirals, threading through the cracks in the floor, the pews, the air. It was everywhere now, wrapping around me, binding me in place as the figure's jagged hand stretched outward. The air grew colder with every moment, the frost biting into my skin as it spread higher, curling around my legs, my arms, threading through the very fabric of my being. My breath fogged the air, each exhale hanging longer than it should, as though the cold was reluctant to let it go. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, each one sending ripples through the frost-covered floor. It tilted its head, the motion sharp and unnatural, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. I tried to step back, but the frost held me in place, its jagged edges curling tighter, sharper, threading through my veins like fire. The whispers grew louder, vibrating through the air, the frost, my very bones. They weren't words anymore, not exactly, but they carried meaning all the same. A command, a judgment, a sentence. The hollowing cannot be undone. The ice in the center of the room began to pulse, its jagged edges shimmering with an otherworldly light that cast fractured shadows across the church walls. The carvings on its surface shifted again, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that felt both familiar and incomprehensible. The frost beneath the ice cracked, splitting into jagged shards that spiraled outward, threading through the air like smoke. The figure raised its hand higher, its long, jagged fingers curling into a shape that seemed deliberate, purposeful. The frost pulsed in response, its sharp edges glinting faintly as it climbed higher, curling around my chest, my throat threading through my veins with a cold that burned. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, cutting through the air like blades, their rhythm sharp and unrelenting. I stumbled forward, the frost breaking beneath my boots, my chest tight, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. My hand reached out instinctively, brushing against the surface of the ice. It was colder than anything I'd ever felt, sharp and biting, threading through my skin like fire. The carvings on its surface glowed brighter, their sharp lines curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The ice surged forward, the frost spreading outward in jagged spirals that curled through the air, the light, the shadows. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently, their shapes twisting and curling in ways that defied reason. The whispers reached a crescendo, their sharp, jagged rhythm threading through my thoughts, cutting through everything else until they were all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The frost froze in place, its jagged edges sharp and unmoving. The light dimmed, its sharp glow fading into a faint, pale flicker. The figure stood still, its jagged form casting long shadows across the frost-covered floor, its empty face turned toward me. The air was heavy with silence, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The frost beneath my feet creaked faintly, its jagged edges shifting, threading through the cracks in the floor. The figure tilted its head again, its movements slow and deliberate, its long, jagged hand curling into a fist. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, pale light that burned into my vision. And then, from deep within the ice, I heard it again. The whispers. They were softer now, faint and distant, threading through the air like an echo. The frost beneath my feet cracked again, its jagged edges splitting into sharp shards that spiraled outward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. The figure raised its hand higher, its movement slow and deliberate, its fingers curling into a shape I couldn't understand. And then, the ice shattered. The force of the blast knocked me to the ground, the air filled with shards of ice and waves of frost. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their shapes unraveling into jagged lines that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. The whispers swelled one final time, sharp and jagged, vibrating through the air with a force that made my chest ache. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The frost on the ground had stopped moving, its jagged edges frozen in place. The carvings on the walls were gone, Their sharp lines faded into faint, pale traces. The air was heavy with silence, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The frost beneath my feet creaked faintly, its jagged edges shifting, threading through the cracks in the floor. I stumbled to my feet, my chest tight, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The church was empty now, its frost-covered walls silent, the jagged carvings gone. The whispers had stopped, but their weight remained, heavier than ever, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. I stepped outside, the pale light of the sky casting long, jagged shadows across the snow-covered ground. The town was as still as it had been when I arrived, its frost-covered buildings leaning against the wind, their sharp edges glinting faintly in the dim light. The air was heavy with silence, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. And then, from deep within the frost, I heard it again. The whispers. I don't know what compelled me to return. Maybe it was the letter. The way its sharp, uneven scrawl seemed to pierce through the paper, as though whoever wrote it knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. Maybe it was the storm, the way the wind howled outside my window that night, whispering my name in the pauses between gusts. Or maybe it was something deeper, something older, threading through my chest, pulling me back to a place I had tried to forget. The road to Black Hollow stretched endlessly in front of me, a narrow ribbon of ice winding through a forest that seemed too quiet, too still. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, clinging to the windshield, muting the world outside until it felt like I was driving through a dream or a nightmare. The heater in the car was useless against the cold, and even with layers of clothing, I couldn't shake the chill that had settled in my bones the moment I'd left the city. The letter sat on the passenger seat, its edges curling from damp, the ink smudged where my fingers had gripped it too tightly. "It's not over. Come back." 4 words. That was all it said. No name, no explanation, just those 4 words. And yet, they had wrapped around my thoughts, threaded through my dreams, pulling me back to the place I'd sworn never to return to. I hadn't been to Black Hollow since I was a child, and even then, I remembered the town as a place of shadow and silence, where the snow fell heavier, the nights stretched longer, and the cold seemed alive. The stretched longer, and the cold seemed alive. The first sign of the town was the wooden gate, leaning precariously against the weight of the storm. The paint on the sign above it had long since peeled away, but the words carved into the wood were still visible. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Beneath it, someone had scratched another message into the wood, jagged and uneven, as though it had been done in a hurry. "Leave now." The wind howled as I passed under the gate, threading through the trees and carrying with it a low, mournful hum that pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The town was barely visible through the snow, a cluster of dark shapes huddled together, their outlines blurred by frost and shadow. The streets were empty, buried under layers of snow, the buildings leaning against the weight of years and ice. It didn't look abandoned, not exactly. It looked suspended, as though time itself had frozen alongside the frost that clung to every surface. I parked the car in front of what looked like an inn, its sign swinging faintly in the wind, the words Hollow Hearth Inn barely legible beneath the frost. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the silence like a scream. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outside, sharp and biting, threading through my layers of clothing and settling deep in my chest. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, its weak flame casting flickering shadows that danced across the frost-covered walls. Furniture was scattered throughout the room, wooden chairs, a long table, a counter with a rusted bell, but everything was covered in a thin layer of frost, as though the cold had seeped into the very foundation of the building, claiming it as its own. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I stepped further inside, the sound sharp and unnatural in the stillness. My breath fogged the air in front of me, hanging longer than it should have, as though the cold was reluctant to let it go. The walls were covered in carvings, their sharp angular lines twisting and curling in ways that made my head ache if I stared too long. They weren't decorative, that much was clear. They were deliberate, purposeful, their shapes too precise, too sharp to be anything else. They looked old, older than the town itself, and yet there was something alive about them, as though they were watching, waiting. I moved further into the room, drawn toward the carvings despite the unease that curled in my chest with every step. The air grew colder the closer I got, the frost on the walls seeming to shimmer faintly in the dim light. My fingers brushed against the surface of one of the carvings, and I recoiled instinctively, the frost biting into my skin like fire. The lines seemed to shift beneath my touch, curling into new shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The wind outside picked up, howling against the walls of the inn, threading through the cracks in the door, and carrying with it a faint, almost melodic hum that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the window, the frost-covered glass reflecting the pale light of the storm outside. The patterns etched into the frost twisted and curled, their shapes mirroring the carvings on the walls. And then, through the fogged glass, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was barely visible through the storm, its outline faint and indistinct, but it was there. It didn't move, didn't react, didn't seem to notice me at all. And yet, I felt its presence pressing against me, threading through the air, the frost, my very thoughts. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped closer to the window, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the frost-covered glass. The figure was gone. The wind howled louder, its mournful hum threading through the silence like a needle through cloth. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, pale light that made my skin crawl. And then, from deep within the storm, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a feeling, threading through the air, curling into my thoughts like smoke. It wasn't calling me. It was commanding me. Return. The word burned into my mind, sharp and jagged, threading through my thoughts like a knife. The frost on the walls seemed to shift, their jagged lines curling into new shapes that I couldn't begin to understand. The whisper grew louder, threading through the silence, cutting through everything else until it was all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The carvings on the walls dimmed, their sharp lines fading into faint, pale traces. The frost on the window stopped moving, its jagged edges frozen in place. But the weight in the air remained, heavier than ever, pressing against me, wrapping around me like a vice. I turned away from the window, my chest tight, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The room was empty, the frost-covered furniture casting long shadows across the floor. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The frost beneath my feet cracked faintly as I stepped back toward the door, the sound sharp and unnatural in the stillness. The carvings on the walls seemed to watch me as I left, their sharp lines pulsing faintly, their shapes twisting and curling into patterns I couldn't understand. And then, just as I reached the door, I heard it again. The whisper. The storm had quieted by morning, but the frost lingered. It clung to every surface, its sharp, intricate patterns carved into the wood, the glass, even the air itself. When I stepped outside, the silence was louder than the storm had been. It pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. The sky was a pale, muted gray, casting the town in a light that felt neither day nor night, just an endless, oppressive in-between. The streets were untouched, the snow smooth and unbroken, as though no one had walked them in years. The buildings leaned inward, their frost-covered windows and doors sealed shut, as if they were holding back some terrible weight. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in the inn. The carvings on the walls had shifted again during the night, their sharp lines twisting into new shapes that left a dull ache behind my eyes whenever I stared too long. The whispers had faded, but they hadn't left. I could feel them, threading through the air, just out of reach. The library was the only building that seemed untouched by time. Its roof was intact, the frost on its windows thinner than the rest of the town. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed into the stillness, sharp and unnatural. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outside, sharp and biting, threading through my skin like needles. The shelves were lined with books, their spines cracked and faded, their titles barely legible. The frost had seeped into the pages, curling around the words, threading through the ink like veins. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I moved deeper into the library, the sound sharp and deliberate in the silence. The air grew heavier with every step, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. I found myself drawn to the back of the library, where a single desk sat beneath a frost-covered window. The surface was cluttered with journals, loose pages and books whose spines were cracked and warped from the frost. One journal in particular caught my eye, its cover darker than the rest, its edges curling inward as though the frost had tried and failed to consume it. The name Eleanor Haddon was scrawled across the front in sharp, uneven letters, the ink faded but still legible. My fingers brushed against the surface, and I recoiled instinctively, the frost biting into my skin with a sharpness that felt almost personal. I opened the journal carefully, my breath fogging the air as I turned the pages. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as though the words had been written in desperation. The first few entries were mundane, detailing the day-to-day life of someone living in Black Hollow decades ago. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, the handwriting more erratic. It started with the frost. We thought it was just the storm, but it wasn't. The frost is alive, it's spreading, it's consuming. I turned the page, my fingers trembling, the frost curling around the edges of the paper like claws. The next entry was shorter, the handwriting jagged, the words almost illegible. We tried to stop it. The ritual didn't work. The seal is breaking. It's already too late. The whispers returned then, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. I looked up, my breath catching in my chest as the frost on the walls began to shift, its sharp lines twisting into shapes that mirrored the carvings I'd seen in the inn. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The frost beneath my feet cracked faintly, its jagged edges curling upward, threading through the light, the shadows, my very thoughts. I stumbled back, the journal slipping from my hands, its pages fluttering shut as it hit the floor. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their sharp lines pulsing with a rhythm that matched the heavy beat of my heart. The whispers grew louder, vibrating through the air, cutting through the silence until they were all I could hear. And then, from somewhere deep within the library, I heard it. A creak. It wasn't loud, just the faint sound of wood shifting under weight, but it was enough. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged the air in front of me. The library was empty, or at least it seemed to be. The shelves stretched into the shadows, their frost-covered edges glinting faintly in the dim light. But the air was alive now, vibrating with an energy that pressed against me, threading through the frost, the carvings, my very soul. The whispers swelled, sharper now, their rhythm jagged and unnatural. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, deliberate and purposeful, cutting through my thoughts like blades. I couldn't understand them, not completely, but their meaning was clear. The seal is broken. The frost on the floor surged forward, curling around my boots, threading through the cracks in the wood, climbing higher with every passing second. I stumbled back toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The frost bit into my skin as I gripped it, sharp and cold, threading through my fingers like fire. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and unnatural, cutting through the whispers like a scream. Outside, the storm had picked up again, the wind howling against the buildings, carrying with it a low, mournful hum that pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The frost on the street seemed thicker now, its sharp edges glinting faintly in the pale light. The town felt heavier, darker, as though the weight of the storm had settled over it completely, pressing it into the ground. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A figure, standing at the edge of the library, its jagged outline barely visible through the storm. It didn't move, didn't react, but its presence was undeniable. The frost around it pulsed faintly, its sharp lines curling upward, threading through the snow, the air, my very thoughts. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to face it fully. But when I blinked, it was gone. The whispers faded as I stepped further into the street, their sharp, jagged rhythm threading into the storm until they were nothing more than a faint echo. The frost beneath my feet cracked faintly, its jagged edges shifting, curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings I'd seen in the library. The air was heavy with silence, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. And then, from somewhere deep within the storm, I heard it again. The creak. The snow was deeper here, out on the edges of the town. It swallowed my boots with every step, the frost curling upward around my legs, clinging to me like it had a purpose. The storm had calmed again, but the silence it left behind was worse. It pressed against me, heavier than the snow, threading through the air, the frost, and my thoughts. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel it, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. I didn't know why I kept moving. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get in the car and leave Black Hollow behind forever. But something deeper pulled me forward, threading through my chest, my veins, my very being. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was closer to inevitability, as though I was walking a path that had already been laid out, my steps guided by forces I couldn't see or understand. The forest rose ahead of me, its trees black and skeletal against the pale, muted sky. The snow seemed thicker here, its surface unbroken, untouched by anything living. The frost on the trees was different from the frost in town, sharper, darker, curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings I'd seen in the library. My breath fogged the air as I stepped beneath the canopy, the branches creaking faintly above me, their jagged edges shifting in the wind. The air grew colder with every step, the frost beneath my feet cracking faintly, its jagged edges curling upward, threading through the snow like veins. The path ahead was narrow, winding through the trees in sharp, deliberate turns that made my chest tighten with every corner. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting and curling at the edges of my vision, threading through the frost, the light, the silence. And then I saw it. The clearing. It opened ahead of me suddenly, the trees falling away to reveal a wide, snow-covered space encircled by stones. They were jagged, uneven, their frost-covered surfaces glinting faintly in the pale light. The carvings on their surface pulsed faintly, their sharp lines twisting and curling in ways that made my head ache if I stared too long. The frost around their bases was thicker, curling upward in jagged spirals that seemed to breathe, to move, threading through the air like smoke. At the center of the clearing, the snow fell away, revealing a wide, jagged hole in the ground. The frost around its edges glowed faintly, its sharp lines curling downward into darkness. The air around it was heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I took a step closer, my breath fogging the air in front of me, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The whispers returned then, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. They weren't calling me, not exactly. They were pulling me, threading through the air, the frost, my very soul. The carvings on the stones pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. I stumbled closer, the frost beneath my feet cracking and splintering with every step. The hole loomed larger now, its edges jagged and uneven, its darkness swallowing the light, the frost, the air. The whispers grew louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts like needles, cutting through everything else until they were all I could hear. And then I reached the edge. The darkness stretched downward, deeper than it should have been, its edges sharp and jagged, curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings on the stones. The frost around it pulsed faintly, its sharp lines curling downward into the void, threading through the light, the shadows, my thoughts. The whispers swelled, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the air, the frost, my very bones. I knelt at the edge, my breath catching in my chest as I reached out, my fingers trembling, brushing against the frost-covered ground. The carvings on the stones pulsed brighter, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, pale light that burned into my vision. The frost around my hand curled upward, threading through my fingers like fire, biting into my skin with a sharpness that felt almost alive. And then from deep within the darkness, I saw it, a shape, faint and indistinct, shifting and curling within the void. It wasn't solid, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, its edges sharp and jagged, its form shifting and curling in ways that defied logic. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence pressing against me, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows, my very soul. The whispers grew louder, their sharp, jagged rhythm threading through the air. The frost, my thoughts. The shape moved closer, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light, its form too deliberate, too precise to be natural. My chest tightened as it loomed closer, its presence heavier, sharper, pressing against me, wrapping around me like a vice. The frost beneath my feet cracked sharply, its jagged edges splitting into sharp shards that spiraled outward, threading through the snow, the air, the light. The carvings on the stones twisted violently, their shapes unraveling into jagged lines that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the darkness. And then the shape spoke. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a feeling, threading through my thoughts like needles, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until it was all I could hear. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them all the same. They carried a weight that pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. The hollowing is near, the seal is breaking. The frost surged upward, curling around my legs, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. I gasped, my breath fogging the air as the frost climbed higher, wrapping around my chest, my throat, threading through my skin like fire. The carvings on the stones pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The shape loomed closer, its presence pressing against me, threading through the air, the frost, the light, the darkness. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the air, the frost, my very bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The frost froze in place, its jagged edges sharp and unmoving. The light dimmed, its sharp glow fading into a faint pale flicker. The whispers fell silent, their sharp rhythm threading into the silence until they were nothing more than a faint echo. The shape remained, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. And then, from deep within the frost, I heard it again. The whisper. The frost clung to me as I descended into the hollow, its jagged edges threading through my boots, curling around my legs, and biting into my skin with every step. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The darkness wasn't total. Faint, pale light radiated from the frost-covered walls, casting jagged shadows that twisted and writhed with every movement. The carvings lined the walls in intricate patterns, their sharp, angular lines glowing faintly, pulsing in time with a rhythm I could feel more than hear. My breath fogged the air, each exhale hanging longer than it should, as though the cold refused to let it go. The frost beneath my feet cracked and splintered with every step, its jagged edges shifting and curling upward, threading through the light, the shadows, and the carvings. The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried meaning all the same. They pressed against my thoughts, threading through my mind like smoke, sharp and deliberate. The descent seemed endless. The narrow path twisted and curled, its edges sharp and jagged, its surface uneven, treacherous. The frost grew thicker, darker, curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings on the walls. The light from the frost grew brighter, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched and curled across the ground, threading through the cracks in the walls. The air, my very thoughts. The air grew colder the deeper I went, sharp and biting, threading through my skin, my veins, my bones. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The whispers grew louder, their sharp, jagged rhythm threading through the air, the frost, my very soul. They weren't pulling me anymore. They were driving me, pressing against me, forcing me deeper, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. And then I reached it. The chamber opened suddenly, the narrow path falling away to reveal a wide, jagged space carved into the ice. The walls were lined with carvings, their sharp lines glowing faintly, twisting and curling into shapes that defied reason. The frost on the ground pulsed faintly, its sharp edges curling upward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. At the center of the chamber stood a massive, jagged structure, its surface glinting faintly in the pale light, its sharp edges casting long shadows that stretched across the frost-covered floor. It wasn't ice, not exactly. It shimmered faintly, its surface dark and translucent, its edges sharp and angular, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The carvings on its surface glowed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The frost around its base pulsed faintly, threading through the cracks in the ground, the air, the shadows. The whispers swelled, sharper now, their rhythm jagged and unnatural. They weren't coming from the chamber, not entirely. They were coming from the structure, threading through the air, the frost, my very thoughts. I took a step closer, my breath fogging the air, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, pale light that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The frost beneath my feet cracked sharply, its jagged edges splitting into sharp shards that spiraled outward, threading through the light, the shadows, the air. The structure loomed larger with every step, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. The whispers grew louder, their sharp, jagged rhythm cutting through the silence, vibrating through the frost, the carvings, my very soul. And then, from deep within the structure, I saw it. A shape, faint and indistinct, shifting and curling within the translucent surface. It wasn't solid, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, its edges sharp and jagged, its form shifting and curling in ways that defied logic. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence pressing against me, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows, my very soul. The frost surged upward, curling around my legs, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. I gasped, my breath fogging the air as the frost climbed higher, wrapping around my chest, my throat, threading through my skin like fire. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. And then, the shape spoke. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a feeling, threading through my thoughts like needles, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until it was all I could hear. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them all the same. They carried a weight that pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. The seal is broken. The hollowing begins. The frost surged forward, curling around the structure, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. The shape within the structure moved closer, its jagged outline glinting faintly in the pale light, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. The whispers swelled, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the air, the frost, my very bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The frost froze in place, its jagged edges sharp and unmoving. The light dimmed, its sharp glow fading into a faint pale flicker. The whispers fell silent, their sharp rhythm threading into the silence until they were nothing more than a faint echo. The shape within the structure remained, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The chamber was silent, its frost-covered walls casting long shadows across the ground, the carvings on their surface dim and unmoving. The frost beneath my feet cracked faintly, its jagged edges shifting, curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings on the walls. And then, from deep within the structure, I heard it again. The whisper. The whisper was louder this time. It threaded through the chamber like smoke, curling around the frost-covered walls, the carvings and the jagged edges of the shadowy structure at its center. I could feel it in my chest, pressing against my ribs, wrapping around my lungs until every breath felt labored, every movement like wading through ice. The frost at my feet cracked again, sharp and deliberate, the sound echoing in the stillness like a warning I didn't understand. The shape inside the structure moved, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light. It wasn't solid, not entirely. It shifted and curled, its sharp lines threading through the frost, the air, my thoughts. The carvings on the walls began to glow again, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision. The frost around the edges of the chamber pulsed faintly, its jagged lines threading upward, curling into the shadows, the light, the air. I didn't want to move, but the pull was stronger now. It wasn't the whispers, it was the frost itself, threading through my veins, wrapping around my chest, pulling me forward with a force I couldn't resist. My legs moved without my permission, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground, the sound sharp and deliberate in the heavy silence. The structure loomed larger with every step, its surface dark and jagged, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The frost surged upward as I reached the base of the structure, curling around my legs, threading through the cracks in the ground, the carvings, my very thoughts. The whispers grew sharper, their jagged rhythm cutting through the silence like a blade, vibrating through the frost, the carvings, my very bones. The shape inside the structure moved closer, its jagged edges sharper now, glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my soul. And then it spoke again. The hollowing must be fulfilled. The words weren't spoken, not exactly. They were pressed into my thoughts, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until they were all I could hear. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my skin like fire. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. The shape inside the structure loomed closer, its jagged outline sharper now, its edges glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence was heavier, sharper, pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. The frost around the structure pulsed brighter, its sharp edges curling upward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. My fingers brushed against the surface of the structure, and I recoiled instinctively, the frost biting into my skin with a sharpness that felt almost alive. The carvings on its surface pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The frost beneath my feet cracked again, its jagged edges splitting into sharp shards that spiraled outward, threading through the air, the frost, the shadows. The whispers swelled, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the chamber, cutting through the silence, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. And then, the shape inside the structure surged forward. It wasn't solid, not entirely. It was a shadow, a presence, threading through the frost, the air, the carvings, my very being. Its jagged edges glinted faintly in the pale light, its form sharp and angular, curling into shapes that defied reason. It pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts, cutting through everything else until it was all I could feel. The frost around the structure surged upward, curling around the carvings, threading through the cracks in the ground, the air, the shadows. The shape moved closer, its jagged outline sharper now, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. And then it offered me a choice. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a feeling, sharp and deliberate, threading through my thoughts, pressing against my chest, my soul. I could feel the meaning behind the words, heavy and suffocating, cutting through everything else until they were all I could hear. Seal the rift, or let it spread. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. The whispers swelled, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the chamber, cutting through the silence, pressing against my chest, my very soul. I could feel the weight of the choice pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. If I sealed the rift, I would be trapped here, consumed by the frost, my very being threaded into the carvings, the shadows, the air. But if I let it spread, the frost would consume everything, threading through the light, the shadows, the world itself. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very soul. The shape loomed closer, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. And then, I made my choice. The frost surged forward, curling around the carvings, the light, the shadows, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. The shape moved closer, its jagged edges sharper now, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. And then, everything went still. The frost froze in place, its jagged edges sharp and unmoving. The light dimmed, its sharp glow fading into a faint pale flicker. The whispers fell silent, their sharp rhythm threading into the silence until they were nothing more than a faint echo. The shape remained, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light, its presence pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my thoughts. And then, from deep within the frost, I became part of it. The hollowing was complete. The snowstorm came without warning. It wasn't the kind of storm that drifts in lazily, announcing its presence with a soft dusting of flakes. No, this storm roared to life like an ambush, suffocating the world around me in white fury. It pressed against the windows of my car, its icy fingers clawing at the glass as if trying to find a way in. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, blanketed in a sheet of blinding snow. No tracks, no signs, no other cars. Just me, alone, swallowed by the storm. Looking back now, I wonder why I didn't stop, why I didn't pull over and wait for it to pass. But there was something about the snow, something more than the cold, the wind, the isolation. It felt alive, deliberate, like it was drawing me forward. It wasn't long before the green highway signs became illegible, their surfaces coated in frost that looked like spidery veins. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to focus, trying to convince myself that this was just another storm, no different from the others I'd driven through before. Then I saw the detour sign. It was old, leaning at an unnatural angle, barely visible through the snowfall. A wooden arrow, half rotted and splintered, pointed to a narrow road that disappeared into the trees. The highway ahead was impossible to navigate, the snow too thick, the visibility non-existent, so I turned. What choice did I have? My tires skidded on the icy pavement as I made the turn, and the road narrowed immediately, flanked by skeletal trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing toward the center like they were trying to block me in. The deeper I drove, the more suffocating the storm became. The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The snow seemed thicker here, not falling so much as hanging in the air, suspended like it was waiting for something. The world outside my windshield became a blur of white and black, the storm swallowing everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm eased. The wind died, the snow thinned, and the silence fell heavy and unnatural. It wasn't the comforting stillness of a quiet winter night. No, this silence pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, as though the world itself was holding its breath. My headlights illuminated a wooden sign leaning against a drift of snow, its paint faded, its letters barely legible. Welcome to Blackwood Pines. I slowed the car, my tires crunching against the snow-covered road, and scanned the area. Blackwood Pines didn't look like much of a town. The buildings were small, clustered close together, their roofs sagging under the weight of the snow. Frost clung to every surface, its sharp crystalline edges glinting faintly in the dim light. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just the eerie glow of my headlights cutting through the gloom. I parked in front of what looked like a general store, its windows dark, its door hanging open slightly. The wind rattled the sign above the entrance, its chains creaking faintly in the silence. The air was colder now, sharper, threading through the gaps in my coat and settling deep in my chest. My breath fogged the air as I stepped out of the car, the sound of my boots crunching against the snow, echoing into the stillness. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally sharp against the silence. Inside, the store was a snapshot of abandonment. Shelves stood half empty, their contents coated in frost. The air was frigid, heavy, pressing against me like a physical weight. At the far end of the store, a counter stood beneath a cracked mirror, its surface littered with frozen papers and shattered glass. Above it, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters across the frost-covered wall, were the words, "The snow will take us all." My chest tightened as I stared at the message. The letters burned into my vision even when I closed my eyes. Something about the words felt deliberate, purposeful, as though they were meant for me. I tried to convince myself it was just graffiti, left behind by some restless traveler or mischievous teenager, but the thought felt hollow. There was a weight to the words, a meaning I couldn't grasp but couldn't ignore. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. At first, I thought it was the cold, the frost clinging to the walls, the floor, the shelves. But then I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating, threading through the air, the frost, my very thoughts. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the air in front of me. And then I saw it. A figure, faint and indistinct, standing in the shadows at the far end of the store. It wasn't solid, not exactly. Its edges were jagged, shifting and curling like smoke, threading through the frost, the light, the air. It didn't move, didn't react, but its presence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. I stumbled back, my boots crunching against the frost-covered floor, and the figure dissolved into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The silence grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. I turned and fled, the door slamming shut behind me with a sound that echoed into the stillness. Outside, the storm had picked up again, the wind howling through the buildings, carrying with it a low, mournful hum that pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The frost on the streets seemed thicker now, its sharp edges curling upward, glinting faintly in the pale light. The town felt darker, heavier, as though the weight of the storm had settled over it completely, pressing it into the ground. I climbed back into my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine groaned against the cold, the headlights flickering weakly as the car sputtered to life. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to leave, to get away from Blackwood Pines and whatever was lurking in its shadows. But as I drove back down the narrow road, the storm grew worse, the snow falling in thick sheets that swallowed the road, the trees, the world itself. And then, through the blinding white, I saw it again. The figure. It stood in the middle of the road, its edges jagged and indistinct, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat as I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, the tires losing traction on the icy road, and I spun out, the world tilting violently before everything went dark. When I woke, the world was still wrapped in that smothering silence. The storm had quieted again, as if the very act of driving me off the road had satisfied its cruel hunger. I opened my eyes to a pale, muted light filtering through the frost-covered windows of my car. The engine was silent now, the dashboard dark. The cold pressed in, sharper than before, threading through the glass, the metal, and my skin. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind felt fragmented, as though pieces of it had splintered and scattered into the frost. My breath fogged the air in front of me, hanging longer than it should have, curling and twisting as though the cold was reluctant to let it go. Outside, the snow was piled high, burying the car up to its doors. The figure in the road was gone, but its presence lingered, threading through the silence, the frost, my very chest. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle. The metal was ice cold beneath my fingers, biting into my skin as I forced the door open. It groaned against the weight of the snow, the sound sharp and unnatural in the heavy stillness. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp and biting, threading through my coat and settling deep in my chest. I climbed out, my boots sinking into the snow, the frost crunching sharply beneath me. The road was gone, swallowed by the storm, its edges blurred and indistinct. The trees loomed taller here, their skeletal branches curling toward the sky, their black bark glinting faintly with frost. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings, but the world felt different now, heavier, sharper, as though the storm had dragged it somewhere else entirely. And then I saw it. The church. It rose out of the snow like a jagged wound, its dark skeletal frame cutting through the pale light. Its steeple leaned at an unnatural angle, the cross at its peak buried in frost. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting faintly, and the door hung open, its wood warped and splintered. The frost around its base was thicker, curling upward in jagged spirals that seemed to breathe, to move, threading through the light, the air, the silence. I don't know why I approached it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way, to get as far from Blackwood Pines as possible. But something deeper pulled me forward, threading through my chest, my veins, my very being. The snow grew deeper as I neared the church, swallowing my boots with every step, the frost curling around my legs, clinging to me like it had a purpose. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and unnatural in the heavy stillness. Inside, the air was colder, sharper, threading through the shadows, the frost, my very soul. The pews were overturned, their wood splintered and frostbitten, and the altar stood cracked and broken, its surface coated in a thick layer of frost. The walls were lined with carvings, their jagged lines twisting and curling into shapes that made my head ache if I stared too long. At the far end of the church, behind the shattered altar, a staircase descended into darkness. The frost around its edges pulsed faintly, its jagged lines curling downward, threading through the cracks in the floor, the air, the shadows. The carvings on the walls seemed to glow brighter here, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that burned into my vision, leaving faint afterimages behind when I blinked. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my breath fogging the air, my chest tight. The darkness below seemed alive, shifting and curling at the edges of my vision, threading through the frost, the light, my very thoughts. And then, from deep within the shadows, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a feeling, threading through my thoughts like smoke, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until it was all I could focus on. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. Come closer. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned against the frigid air. The frost around my boots curled upward, threading through the cracks in the floor, the light, the shadows. And then, before I realized what I was doing, I was descending the stairs, my steps slow, deliberate, each one echoing into the silence like a heartbeat. The darkness swallowed me. The air here was heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The frost on the walls glowed faintly, its sharp edges curling into shapes that mirrored the carvings in the church above. The whispers grew louder, their sharp, jagged rhythm threading through the air. The frost, my very thoughts. They weren't pulling me anymore. They were driving me, pressing against me, forcing me deeper, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a wide, jagged chamber carved into the frost. The walls were lined with carvings, their sharp lines glowing faintly, twisting and curling into shapes that defied reason. The frost on the ground pulsed faintly, its sharp edges curling upward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. At the center of the chamber stood a massive, jagged structure, its surface dark and translucent, its sharp edges casting long shadows that stretched across the frost-covered floor. It wasn't ice, not exactly. It shimmered faintly, its surface dark and jagged, its edges glinting faintly in the pale light. The carvings on its surface pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision. The frost around its base was thicker, curling upward in jagged spirals that seemed to breathe, to move, threading through the air, the shadows, my very thoughts. The whispers swelled, their sharp, jagged rhythm vibrating through the air, the frost, my very bones. And then, from deep within the darkness, I saw it. A shape, faint and indistinct, shifting and curling within the jagged structure. It wasn't solid, not entirely. It was more like a shadow, its edges sharp and jagged, its form shifting and curling in ways that defied logic. Its presence pressed against me, threading through the frost, the air, my very soul. And then it spoke. The hollowing has begun. The words, or rather the presence of them, didn't leave me. They clung to my thoughts like frost to glass, threading through the air, through my very breathing. The hollowing has begun. The sound or the feeling of it still echoed through my skull. It wasn't spoken, not the way I understood words, but it carried weight, a force that pressed against me like the crushing coal. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the frost-coated ground. My breath came in sharp bursts, visible against the freezing air, curling upward only to dissipate in unnatural stillness. The jagged structure at the center of the chamber pulsed faintly, its edges glowing with a pale, icy light that cut through the darkness but revealed nothing comforting. I turned toward the stairs, but the path I had descended had disappeared. The opening in the wall was no longer there, replaced by a seamless expanse of carvings and frost. Panic surged through me, a warmth that was quickly extinguished by the cold pressing in from all sides. I didn't scream. I wasn't sure I had the energy. My chest felt constricted, the frost curling around me like invisible threads, tightening with each passing second. I spun back to face the structure at the center, its jagged surface now glinting brighter, casting long shadows that stretched and writhed across the chamber floor. And then the carvings on the walls began to move. It started slowly, with faint pulses of light tracing the jagged patterns that ran across the frost-covered walls. But soon, the lines began to shift, curling and twisting, forming new shapes that seemed to mock the very idea of logic. My eyes couldn't follow them. Every time I thought I recognized a pattern, it unraveled, threading itself into something sharper, darker, impossible to comprehend. The whispers returned, louder now, their jagged rhythm vibrating through the frost, the air, my very bones. They overlapped, layering on top of one another until they became an unbearable cacophony of sound. Or maybe thought. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. My hands flew to my ears, but it did nothing to stop them. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside me, threading through my mind, unraveling it one thread at a time. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the whispers, the light, the frost, the carvings. Time didn't exist here, not the way I understood it. Seconds, minutes, hours, they all bled into one another, lost in the jagged chaos of the chamber. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against me like a physical force. The light from the carvings dimmed, their sharp lines fading into faint shadows. The frost beneath my feet seemed to still, its jagged edges no longer curling upward, no longer moving with the rhythm of the whispers. The structure at the center of the chamber was the only thing that remained unchanged, its jagged surface glinting faintly in the pale light. But from within its dark, translucent form, the shape began to move. It wasn't a person, not exactly. Its edges were too sharp, its movements too fluid, too deliberate. It shifted and curled within the structure, its form defying logic, threading through the frost, the air, the shadows. And then it began to take shape. Its edges sharpened, its form solidifying into something that resembled a figure, but only just. It was tall, impossibly tall, its jagged outline glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. And then it spoke again. "The seal is broken. You are the key." The words, or the meaning of them, hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in their weight. My knees buckled, and I fell to the frost-covered ground, the sharp edges biting into my skin, threading through my clothes, my flesh, my very being. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. My vision blurred, the chamber spinning around me in a jagged spiral of frost and shadow. The figure, or the shadow of it, moved closer, its jagged outline growing sharper, its presence heavier. The frost around it surged upward, curling into jagged spirals that threaded through the air, the carvings, the shadows. The whispers returned, softer this time, threading through my thoughts like smoke, sharp and deliberate, cutting through everything else until they were all I could hear. And then it reached for me. I couldn't move. The frost held me in place, its jagged edges curling around my legs, my arms, my chest. The figure's hand, or what passed for a hand, was sharp, jagged, its edges glinting faintly in the pale light. It pressed its fingers against my chest, and the frost surged, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very soul. You will open the door. The words, or the command, burned through me, threading through my mind, unraveling everything else until it was all that remained. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines spiraling outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the light. The frost beneath me surged upward, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my skin like fire. And then I was falling. The chamber disappeared, swallowed by the frost, the light, the shadows. The figure's presence remained, threading through the darkness, the silence, my very thoughts. The frost clung to me, its jagged edges biting into my skin, threading through my veins, my soul. The whispers grew louder, their jagged rhythm vibrating through the darkness, cutting through the silence, pressing against my chest, my very being. And then I hit the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, the frost biting into my skin, my chest, my soul. The world around me was dark, heavy, suffocating. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence that pressed against me like a weight I couldn't lift. I tried to move, but the frost held me in place, its jagged edges threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. And then, from deep within the darkness, I heard it again, the whisper. The frost had become a living thing, threading through the air and into my very thoughts, weaving itself into every fragment of my mind. I lay there, surrounded by the darkness, its weight pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. My breaths came in short, sharp bursts, each one dragging a burning cold deeper into my lungs. It wasn't just the air, it was something more, something alive, something watching. The whisper that had drawn me deeper into this place was silent now, replaced by an even heavier absence. The frost beneath me pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own, its jagged edges curling upward and biting into my skin. I tried to move, but my body felt leaden, tethered to the icy ground by threads of frost that had burrowed into my veins. And then the darkness began to shift. It started at the edges of my vision, faint and indistinct, curling and threading its way inward like smoke. Shapes emerged, their forms jagged and impossible, shifting and unraveling before I could make sense of them. They weren't shadows, not exactly. They moved with purpose, threading through the frost, the air, my thoughts, pressing against me with a weight I couldn't understand. The silence broke. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more like a presence, pressing against my mind with sharp, deliberate force, unraveling my thoughts until there was nothing left but its voice. The whisper returned, but this time it was louder, sharper, cutting through the air like a blade. The hollowing will consume all. The words threaded through me, their jagged edges biting into my mind, carving themselves into the very fabric of my being. The frost around me pulsed brighter, its sharp edges curling upward, threading through the darkness, the shapes, the shadows. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my soul, until I felt like I was drowning in it. The shapes moved closer, their jagged forms shifting and curling, threading through the frost, the shadows, the air. They weren't solid, not entirely. Their edges were sharp, glinting faintly in the pale, icy light that seemed to emanate from the frost itself. Their presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very being. One of the shapes stopped, looming over me, its jagged outline sharp and glinting in the faint light. It leaned closer, its presence suffocating, threading through my thoughts, my breath, my soul. I could feel its weight pressing against me, unraveling everything else until it was all that remained. And then it spoke. "You are chosen." The words, or the meaning of them, hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in their weight. The frost surged upward, curling around my legs, my arms, my chest, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very soul. The other shapes moved closer, their jagged forms pressing against me, threading through the frost, the air, the darkness. The carvings on the walls I hadn't noticed until now, began to glow, their jagged lines twisting and curling into shapes that defied logic. The frost on the ground pulsed brighter, its sharp edges curling upward, threading through the carvings, the light, the shadows. The shapes moved closer still, their presence heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest, my very soul. And then I understood. The frost, the carvings, the whispers, it was all part of the same thing, the same entity. It wasn't just alive, it was awake, aware, threading itself through the frost, the air, my thoughts, my very being. It was the hollowing, and I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The jagged shape that loomed over me leaned closer still, its sharp edges glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost around me surged higher, curling around my throat, threading through my skin, my thoughts, my very being. "You will open the way." The words, or the command, burned through me, carving themselves into my mind, threading through my thoughts like smoke, sharp and deliberate. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. The frost beneath me surged upward, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. I tried to fight it, but it was stronger than me. The frost threaded through my veins, my thoughts, my soul, unraveling everything else until it was all that remained. The jagged shape loomed closer, its presence pressing against me, suffocating me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. And then it began. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, the shadows, the carvings, threading itself into the very fabric of the chamber. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their sharp lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision. The whispers grew louder, their jagged rhythm vibrating through the frost, the air, my very bones. And then, from deep within the frost, something moved. It wasn't the shapes, they were frozen now, their jagged forms glinting faintly in the pale light. It was something deeper, something darker, threading through the frost, the air, the shadows. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. And then, from deep within the frost, I heard it. The door will open. The air itself seemed to freeze, crystallizing around me, heavy and sharp. The frost beneath me pulsed like a living thing, its jagged edges digging into my skin, threading through my thoughts, and anchoring me in place. I could barely move. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice, slicing through my chest and lingering there. The words, the ones that had carved themselves into my mind, "The door will open," echoed endlessly, each repetition heavier, darker, more final. The carvings on the walls burned brighter now, their jagged lines twisting and curling into impossible patterns that seemed to writhe, alive and pulsing with a rhythm I couldn't comprehend. They didn't glow with warmth. Instead, the light was cold, hollow, the kind that didn't illuminate but devoured. My vision blurred as I tried to focus on them, the sharp edges etching themselves into my thoughts with every passing second. I didn't know what lay beyond the door, whether it was salvation or damnation, but I could feel it. Its presence was pressing against the air, against me, threading through the frost, the shadows, my very being. The frost beneath me surged higher, curling around my chest, my arms, my throat, holding me in place as the jagged shapes around me began to stir again. The shapes, or whatever they were, moved with a strange, deliberate grace, their jagged forms twisting and curling through the frost, threading themselves into the air, the carvings, the light. They didn't approach me this time. Instead, they circled the jagged structure at the center of the chamber, their sharp outlines glinting faintly as they moved. The whispers returned, louder now, their jagged rhythm threading through the frost, the shadows, my very thoughts. The seal is breaking. The words, or the weight of them, hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in their meaning. I could feel the truth of them, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The seal wasn't breaking. It was already broken, and I was the one who had broken it. The jagged structure pulsed brighter now, its sharp edges glinting faintly as the carvings on its surface twisted and curled into shapes that defied reason. The frost around its base surged upward, curling into jagged spirals that threaded through the air, the carvings, the shadows. The whispers grew louder still, their rhythm vibrating through the frost, the air, my very bones. I tried to move, to fight, but the frost held me in place, its jagged edges biting into my skin, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The jagged shapes around the structure moved faster now, their forms twisting and curling through the frost, threading themselves into the carvings, the shadows, the light. The structure pulsed brighter, its edges glinting like blades, cutting through the air, the frost, my thoughts. And then, it happened. The carvings on the walls exploded outward, their jagged lines threading through the frost, the shadows, the air. The frost beneath me surged upward, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The jagged structure at the center of the chamber began to crack, its sharp edges splintering, glinting faintly in the pale, icy light. The cracks spread quickly, threading through the structure like veins, their sharp lines pulsing faintly as they grew. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my soul. The whispers were deafening now, their jagged rhythm vibrating through the frost, the air, my very bones. And then, the structure shattered. The sound wasn't loud, not exactly. It was deeper, heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The shards of the structure didn't fall. They hovered in the air, their jagged edges glinting faintly, threading themselves into the frost, the carvings, the shadows. And then, from the darkness at its core, something emerged. It wasn't a shape, not exactly. Its edges were too jagged, its form too fluid, too deliberate. It shifted and curled through the frost, threading itself into the air, the carvings, the light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. It wasn't just alive, it was the frost, the carvings, the whispers, the darkness, the light. It was everything. And then it spoke. The hollowing is complete. The words, or the meaning of them, burned through me, carving themselves into my thoughts, threading through my mind like smoke, sharp and deliberate. The frost around me surged higher, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my very being. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines spiraling outward, threading through the frost, the light, the shadows. The jagged shape, or the presence of it, moved closer, its edges glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. I could feel it unraveling me, threading itself into the very fabric of my being, consuming everything else, until it was all that remained. And then I understood. The hollowing wasn't a thing, or a place, or even an entity. It was everything. The frost, the carvings, the shadows, the light. It was the storm that had brought me here, the silence that had suffocated me, the whispers that had unraveled my thoughts. It was me. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, the shadows, the carvings, threading itself into the very fabric of the chamber. The jagged shapes dissolved into the frost, their sharp edges unraveling into threads of light and shadow that spiraled outward, threading through the darkness, the silence, my very thoughts. And then, from deep within the frost, I felt it. The door. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was a presence, pressing against the air, against me, threading through the frost, the shadows, my very being. It wasn't a door that opened outward. It opened inward, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. And then it opened. The frost surged, the carvings twisted, the shadows unraveled, and everything dissolved into the light. The road was a narrow thread of asphalt, swallowed by the relentless winter storm. Snow fell in heavy sheets, thick and suffocating, swirling in chaotic patterns as if the storm itself were alive, dancing with a cruel, deliberate rhythm. My headlights barely penetrated the white curtain, the beams refracting into halos that only deepened the darkness ahead. Every mile felt heavier than the last, the silence inside the car broken only by the rhythmic hum of the wipers and the low rumble of the heater, struggling against the cold. The forest loomed on either side, its skeletal trees clawing upward into the storm. The deeper I drove, the more it felt like the trees weren't simply stationary. They were watching, judging diet, waiting. Their bare branches twisted unnaturally, coated in frost so thick it glittered like glass. The road narrowed further, and for a moment the thought crept in, turn back. But I couldn't. Something deeper than curiosity drove me forward, threading through my thoughts like a siren's call. I'd read about this place, seen the faint whispers on obscure forums and half-buried posts online. People had gone searching for the old Black Ridge Lodge before me, drawn by its unsettling history, some chasing ghosts, others chasing thrill. Most of them had never returned. Those who did spoke only in fragmented, trembling phrases about the veil and the storm that never lifted. Their words were disjointed, like the memories themselves were unraveling. And yet, even knowing all of this, I came. The turn-off to the lodge appeared suddenly, the old wooden sign leaning precariously into the snow, its painted letters barely visible under layers of ice. Black Ridge Lodge, 3 miles. The arrow pointed down a narrower path, where the snow seemed to thicken into an impenetrable wall. My tires crunched over the icy trail, the sound unnaturally loud against the heavy silence of the forest. The car struggled for traction as the path twisted and climbed, the blizzard swallowing the world around me. I began to lose all sense of time. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. The snow battered the windshield, the storm screaming like a wounded animal, and the trees seemed to press closer, their branches arching downward as if trying to block the way. My chest tightened with unease, an irrational but undeniable certainty that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the storm. I could feel it, threading through the frost and shadows, something watching, waiting. And then I saw it. The lodge emerged from the blizzard like a jagged wound against the snow-covered forest. Its structure was massive yet gaunt, its dark wood frame leaning unnaturally, as though it were trying to shrink from the storm. Icicles hung from the eaves like jagged teeth, and frost coated every surface, giving it the appearance of a relic entombed in ice. No light came from within. The windows were dark, lifeless. The storm seemed to quiet here, the snow falling slower, heavier, as though it had finally found its target. I parked at the base of a crumbling stone stairway leading to the entrance, the car's engine sputtering and wheezing against the cold. I turned off the ignition, and the sudden silence was deafening. For a moment, I simply sat there, staring at the lodge through the frost-covered windshield, my breath fogging the air in front of me. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle, the cold biting into my skin as I stepped out into the snow. The air outside was sharper than I'd imagined, each breath like shards of glass cutting through my lungs. The storm had dulled to a whisper, but the stillness was worse somehow. The snow beneath my boots crunched loudly, the sound too loud, echoing into the emptiness. As I climbed the stairs, I felt the weight of the lodge pressing down on me, its dark windows staring like empty eyes. The front door was partially ajar, its wood warped and splintered, revealing a faint glimpse of darkness within. I hesitated, one foot on the threshold, my breath fogging in the cold air. A strange sensation crept over me, like standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind pushing you forward. The darkness inside seemed alive, deeper than it should have been, threaded with something I couldn't name but felt in my chest, heavy and suffocating. I stepped inside. The air was colder here, impossibly so, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin but burrows deep, threading through your bones. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, their surface slick with frost that glittered faintly in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The room smelled of decay, wood rotting beneath layers of ice, faintly metallic, sharp, and unnatural. My breath fogged the air in front of me, the mist curling and twisting in patterns that seemed too deliberate, too alive. The entryway opened into a wide hall, its walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled away in jagged strips, revealing splinters of dark wood beneath. Furniture was scattered haphazardly, coated in frost so thick it seemed sculpted from ice. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its surface cracked and blackened, as though something inside had burned far hotter than it should have. Above the mantel, a mirror hung crookedly, its surface clouded with frost that moved faintly, like it was breathing. I approached the mirror cautiously, my boots crunching over the frost-covered floor. The reflection was wrong, not distorted but delayed, as though the image was struggling to keep up with my movements. When I raised a hand to touch the glass, my reflection stayed still, staring back at me with a blank, empty expression. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the frost around me seemed to pulse, threading through the air like smoke. The lodge groaned, its walls shifting faintly, and for the first time I realized that the storm outside hadn't stopped. I could hear it pressing against the walls, the roof whispering through the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the lodge. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back to the car, to drive as far away from this place as possible. But I didn't. I couldn't. The air pressed heavier against my chest, threading through my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the lodge. The shadows seemed to grow sharper, curling at the edges of the room, watching, waiting. And then, from deep within the lodge, I heard it. A sound, not a whisper, not exactly. It was deeper, heavier, threading through the air like a pulse, slow and deliberate. It wasn't coming from outside, or even from the walls. It was coming from below. The sound rose and fell, a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the frost-covered walls and deep into my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't mechanical. It felt ancient, alive, like the beating heart of the lodge itself. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this place before it swallowed me whole, but my feet moved forward instead, as if pulled by invisible strings. The frost beneath my boots crunched loudly, echoing in the suffocating stillness. The hall seemed to stretch longer than it should have, the frost creeping upward along the walls, forming jagged, unnatural patterns. The cold grew sharper, pressing into my skin, threading through my veins like a living thing. I reached the far end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My breath hung heavy in the air as I pushed it open, the wood groaning like a wounded animal. Beyond the door was a staircase, its steps steep and narrow, descending into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The rhythmic hum grew louder here, pulsing in time with the frost that curled along the edges of the stairs. I hesitated, gripping the icy railing, but the pull was too strong. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound swallowed immediately by the oppressive silence. The air grew heavier as I descended, thick with a cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. The walls on either side of the staircase were rough and jagged, carved from the same dark wood as the lodge above, but coated in frost, so thick it looked like glass. Shapes moved within the frost, faint and indistinct, their jagged outlines shifting and curling in ways that made my head ache. I couldn't look at them for too long. They seemed to writhe and twist, threading through my thoughts, unmaking them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air changed. It was colder here, impossibly so, and the frost-covered ground seemed to pulse faintly beneath my boots. The rhythmic hum was louder now, reverberating through the walls, the floor, my very chest. The space opened into a large, cavernous room, its walls lined with carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. The carvings weren't decorative, they were deliberate, sharp, their jagged lines twisting and curling into patterns that defied logic. My eyes couldn't follow them every time I tried. My vision blurred, and the carvings seemed to shift, threading themselves deeper into the frost, the shadows, my thoughts. At the center of the room stood a massive stone slab, its surface coated in frost that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The carvings on its surface were deeper, sharper, their jagged lines glowing brighter than the walls around it. The frost at its base curled upward, threading itself into the air like smoke. The rhythmic hum seemed to emanate from the slab, its vibrations threading through the frost, the carvings, the shadows. I approached cautiously, each step slower than the last, the frost beneath me crunching sharply with every movement. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. The carvings on the walls seemed to twist and curl in response, their jagged lines glowing brighter, threading through the frost, the shadows, the light. When I reached the slab, I hesitated, my breath fogging the air in front of me. The frost on its surface seemed to move faintly, curling and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The carvings pulsed brighter, their sharp lines cutting through the frost, the air, my thoughts. And then, from deep within the stone, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a reflection, not exactly. Its edges were too sharp, its movements too fluid, threading through the frost like smoke, deliberate and alive. It moved within the slab, its form shifting and curling, threading itself into the carvings, the frost, the air. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very being. And then it spoke. "You've come." The voice, or the weight of it, hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in its meaning. It wasn't a sound, it was deeper, heavier, threading through the air, the frost, my thoughts, my very soul. The carvings on the slab twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling into jagged shapes that spiraled outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the light. The shadow within the slab shifted, its jagged outline growing sharper, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. The frost beneath me surged upward, curling around my boots, threading through my veins, my very soul. The air grew heavier, sharper, suffocating, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. You were always meant to find me. The words, or the meaning of them, threaded through my mind, carving themselves into my thoughts, unraveling everything else, until they were all that remained. The frost surged higher, curling around my legs, my arms, my chest, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines spiraling outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the air. And then the shadow moved. It didn't leave the slab, not exactly. Instead, it threaded itself into the frost, curling through the carvings, the shadows, the light. Its presence pressed against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The air grew heavier, sharper, suffocating, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. The shadow within the frost shifted closer, its jagged outline glinting faintly in the pale light. Its presence pressed against me, unraveling my thoughts, my breath, my soul. The frost around me surged higher, curling around my throat, threading through my veins, my very being. The veil will claim you. The words, or the truth of them, sank into my chest like a blade, threading through my thoughts, unraveling everything else until they were all that remained. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, the shadows, the carvings, threading itself into the very fabric of the room. And then, from deep within the frost, I felt it. The veil. It wasn't a thing, not exactly. It was a presence, pressing against the air, against me, threading through the frost, the shadows, my very being. And it was waiting. The air pressed against me like a living weight, heavy and cold, threading through my chest and lungs, making every breath a labor. The frost clung tighter now, winding up my legs and curling around my ribs, its jagged edges cutting into my skin, not in a physical way, but in something deeper, something that reached into my thoughts. My vision blurred, the carvings on the walls spinning and twisting into patterns I couldn't follow, each line threading deeper into the darkness. The shadow that had emerged from the slab was no longer contained. It had bled into the room, curling through the frost like smoke, weaving itself into the air, into the walls, into me. Its presence was overwhelming, a force that pressed not just against my body but into my mind, unraveling my thoughts and threading them with something colder, darker. The veil was no longer just a concept or a whisper. It was here. And I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The room felt larger than before, its boundaries stretching and bending, like a reflection in fractured glass. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their jagged lines glowing with an icy light that burned into my vision. I tried to step back, but the frost beneath me held firm, curling tighter around my boots, my ankles, my legs. The shadow moved closer, its outline growing sharper, its presence heavier, threading itself into the air and the frost and my very being. "You cannot leave," it said, not in words, but in something deeper, something that threaded through the frost and carved itself into my thoughts. "You were always meant to stay." The frost surged higher, curling around my waist, my chest, threading through my veins, my very soul. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling and spiraling outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the light. The hum that had filled the room before was louder now, vibrating through the air and the frost and my bones, a rhythmic pulse that matched the pounding of my heart. I closed my eyes, but it made no difference. The frost was inside me now, threading through my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. Memories surfaced, images of snow-covered trees and the winding path that had led me here, of dark roads and suffocating silence, of the overwhelming sense of something waiting, watching. But they weren't just memories. They were fractured, jagged, threaded through with something darker, something colder. The shadow was beside me now, its presence suffocating, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light. It didn't move like a person. It moved like the frost, curling and twisting and threading itself into the air, into the carvings, into me. Its form shifted constantly, never solid, always just on the edge of comprehension. And yet, it felt familiar, like I had seen it before, like it had always been there, threading through the edges of my thoughts. "You were chosen," it said, the weight of its voice pressing into my chest, carving itself into my mind. "The veil has always known you." The frost beneath me cracked sharply, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The ground trembled, and the carvings on the walls flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and curling into shapes that burned into my vision. The shadow moved closer still, its presence threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. The frost surged higher, curling around my throat, my arms, my chest, binding me in place as the shadow loomed over me. And then, it reached for me. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, was sharp and jagged, its edges glinting faintly in the icy light. It pressed its fingers against my chest, and the frost surged, threading through my skin, my veins, my very soul. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their sharp lines unraveling and spiraling outward, threading through the frost, the shadows, the light. The veil demands you. The words, or the weight of them, carved themselves into my thoughts, threading through my mind like smoke, sharp and deliberate. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, the shadows, the carvings, threading itself into the very fabric of the room. The shadow pressed harder against me, its presence unraveling my thoughts, my breath, my soul. The air grew heavier, sharper, suffocating, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. And then the frost cracked again. It wasn't just the ground this time. It was everything. The walls, the carvings, the shadows, even the air itself seemed to splinter, jagged cracks threading through the room like veins. The shadow recoiled, its form shifting and curling in jagged spirals, threading itself into the frost and the darkness. The hum that had filled the room before was louder now, vibrating through the frost and the shadows and my very bones, a rhythmic pulse that matched the cracking of the frost. The ground beneath me gave way. For a moment, I was weightless, the frost and the air and the shadows spinning around me in jagged spirals. The hum was deafening now, threading through my chest and my thoughts and my very soul, drowning out everything else. The shadow was still there, its presence pressing against me, threading itself into the frost and the air and the darkness. And then I hit the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, the frost biting into my skin, my chest, my soul. The world around me was dark, heavy, suffocating. The hum was gone, replaced by a silence that pressed against me like a weight I couldn't lift. I tried to move, but the frost held me in place, its jagged edges threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very being. And then, from deep within the darkness, I heard it again. The whisper. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence in itself, pressing against me with the weight of the frost that had burrowed into my chest. I lay there, sprawled on the icy ground, my breath curling into the air like smoke. The frost beneath me pulsed faintly, alive and deliberate, its jagged edges biting into my skin. My thoughts, threading deeper into my mind with every passing second. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, thicker than before, heavier, threading itself into the frost and the air and the edges of my consciousness. It wasn't just darkness, it was alive, moving and breathing, curling around me like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My body felt heavy, pinned to the ground by the weight of the frost and the presence that loomed above me. And then it moved. The whisper returned, threading through the frost and the silence, carving itself into my thoughts like jagged lines in ice. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was deeper, heavier, unraveling my thoughts and threading itself into the very fabric of my being. The frost around me surged upward, curling around my arms, my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my very soul. I tried to move, to fight, but the frost held firm, its jagged edges biting into my skin, threading deeper into my thoughts, unraveling everything else until it was all that remained. The carvings that had once lined the walls above were gone now, their sharp lines replaced by a suffocating void that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The frost pulsed brighter, its light carving jagged shadows into the darkness, shapes that twisted and curled unnaturally, threading through the air like smoke. And then I saw it. The shadow returned, curling and twisting through the frost, threading itself into the darkness and the silence and the frost itself. Its form was sharper now, its edges jagged and deliberate, its presence pressing against me with a weight I couldn't bear. It moved closer, threading through the frost and the darkness, its form unraveling and reforming, always shifting, always sharp. You belong to the veil. The words, or the truth of them, carved themselves into my mind, threading through my thoughts like smoke, unraveling everything else until they were all that remained. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my throat, threading through my veins, my very soul. The shadow pressed closer, its presence suffocating, threading itself into the air and the frost and the darkness. The ground beneath me cracked sharply, the sound echoing through the void like a scream. The frost pulsed brighter, its sharp edges curling and twisting into shapes that defied logic, threading through the darkness and the shadow and my thoughts. The shadow loomed above me now, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale light, its presence pressing against my chest, my soul, unraveling everything else until it was all that remained. The door must open. The words, or the command, threaded through the frost and the darkness, carving themselves into my thoughts with sharp, deliberate force. The frost surged outward, curling through the air and the shadows, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks spreading outward in jagged lines that pulsed faintly, threading themselves into the frost and the darkness and the shadow. And then, from deep within the frost, something moved. It wasn't the shadow. Not exactly. It was deeper, darker, threading itself through the frost and the cracks and the air itself. Its presence pressed against me, heavier than the frost, sharper than the shadow, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost around me surged upward, curling around my throat, threading itself into my skin, my thoughts, my very being. The shadow recoiled, its jagged form unraveling and reforming, threading itself into the frost and the darkness and the presence that loomed above. The frost pulsed brighter, its sharp edges cutting through the air, and the shadows and the cracks carving jagged lines into the void. The presence moved closer, its weight pressing against me, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. And then it spoke. You are the key. The words, or the meaning of them, hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in their weight. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my arms, my throat, threading through my veins, my thoughts, my very soul. The shadow moved closer, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale light, threading itself into the frost and the darkness and the presence that loomed above. The cracks in the ground spread farther, their jagged lines pulsing faintly, threading themselves into the frost and the shadows and the void. The frost around me surged outward, curling through the air and the darkness, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. The presence pressed harder against me, unraveling my thoughts, my breath, my soul. And then the frost cracked again. The ground beneath me gave way, the frost and the shadows and the darkness spinning around me in jagged spirals. The presence pressed closer, threading itself into my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost around me surged higher, curling around my throat, threading through my skin, my thoughts, my very being. And then, from deep within the void, I felt it. The door. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was a presence, pressing against the frost and the shadows and the darkness, threading itself into the very fabric of my being. And it was waiting. The frost surged outward, curling through the air and the shadows and the darkness, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. And then, from deep within the frost, I heard it. Open die. The frost surged like a living tide, crawling over my skin, threading through the very marrow of my bones. The words, it was hard to call them that, pressed into my mind like jagged shards of ice, carving themselves deeper with every repetition. Open dight air. Open dight. Open dight. They weren't a command. Not exactly. They were a truth, an inevitability. The door wasn't just waiting, it was demanding. I could feel it now, looming in the darkness beyond the frost, an overwhelming presence that pressed against the air, against the frost, against me. It wasn't just a door, it was the door, the origin of the frost, the shadow, the veil itself, and I was its key. The ground beneath me trembled, cracks threading outward in jagged patterns that pulsed faintly, glowing with an icy light. The frost curled and twisted through the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the ground, the air, the shadows. The presence above me grew heavier, sharper, threading itself into the frost, the cracks, the darkness. The shadow loomed closer, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale, icy light. It didn't move like a person. It moved like the frost, curling and twisting and threading itself into the air, into the darkness, into me. Its edges were sharper now, cutting through the frost and the cracks and the air itself, unraveling everything it touched. I could feel it threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. You cannot resist. The voice, or the meaning of it, pressed against me like a weight I couldn't lift, threading itself into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my arms, my throat, threading through my veins, my very being. The cracks in the ground spread farther, their jagged lines pulsing brighter, threading themselves into the frost and the shadows and the air. The door was closer now, though I couldn't see it. I could feel it, pressing against the frost and the cracks and the darkness, threading itself into the very fabric of the room. It wasn't a door that opened outward, it opened inward, threading through my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost around me surged upward, curling around my throat, threading through my skin, my thoughts, my very being. The shadow moved closer, its jagged form unraveling and reforming, threading itself into the frost and the cracks and the darkness. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks spreading outward in jagged lines that glowed brighter, threading themselves into the frost and the shadows and the air. And then the door began to open. It wasn't a physical movement, not exactly. It was deeper, heavier, threading itself into the frost and the cracks and the shadows, unraveling everything it touched. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, and the shadows and the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. The presence above me pressed closer, its weight suffocating, threading itself into the frost and the cracks and the air. The shadow loomed above me now, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale light, threading itself into the frost and the darkness and the presence that loomed above. You are the key. The words, or the truth of them, threaded through my mind like smoke, sharp and deliberate, unraveling everything else until they were all that remained. The frost surged higher, curling around my chest, my arms, my throat, threading through my veins, my very soul. The cracks in the ground spread farther, their jagged lines pulsing brighter, threading themselves into the frost and the shadows and the air. The door was open now, though I couldn't see it. I could feel it, pressing against the frost and the cracks and the darkness, threading itself into the very fabric of the room. The air grew heavier, sharper, pressing against my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, and the shadows and the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. The presence above me moved closer, its weight suffocating, threading itself into the frost and the cracks and the air. The shadow loomed above me now, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale light, threading itself into the frost and the darkness and the presence that loomed above. And then I felt it. The veil. It wasn't just a presence, it was everything. The frost, the shadows, the cracks, the air. It pressed against me with a weight I couldn't bear, threading itself into my chest, my veins, my very soul. The frost surged higher, curling around my throat, threading through my skin, my thoughts, my very being. The door was open now, and the veil was stepping through. The frost surged outward, curling through the air, and the shadows and the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. The presence above me pressed closer, its weight suffocating, threading itself into the frost and the cracks and the air. The shadow loomed above me now, its jagged form glinting faintly in the pale light, threading itself into the frost and the darkness and the presence that loomed above. And then, the frost unraveled. It wasn't a release, it was a transformation, threading itself deeper into my veins, my thoughts, my very soul. The veil wasn't consuming me, it was becoming me, threading itself into every fiber of my being until there was nothing else. The frost surged higher, curling through the air and the shadows and the cracks, threading itself into the very fabric of the void. And then there was nothing. The frost, the shadows, the cracks, the air, all of it dissolved into the veil, threading itself into the very fabric of existence. I was no longer separate from it. I was part of it now, threading through the frost and the shadows and the cracks, unraveling and reforming in an endless cycle. The veil had claimed me, and the door remained open.